These are excerpts from an interview by Casey Muratori, who I first met back in the 1990s, and who was one of the early playtesters of Braid. And, as you'll hear in the interview, Casey was responsible for a substantial portion of the original ideas that inspired this game.
I guess I don't really know, but I know you've said that you got the idea for Braid in late 2004.
Yeah, well, it was your idea, actually.
And I've always been a little confused by that, but I mean, I guess I sort of know what you mean. But so why don't you walk us through exactly what that means? Because obviously there's the email that I wrote that I think you're referring to.
Yeah.
But I think there's a deeper through line there, because that part is just one piece of it. There's the whole thing with like invisible cities and there's all these other lineages that are like involved there, and I don't really know in what order these start gelling together. It's obviously not just like, oh, there's this one email and everything happened after the email. There was like a bunch of things, I feel like. So
yes. There are many factors that it's hard to place, but before the email, sort of the background that was percolating was Invisible Cities was one of my favorite books, and there were other works at the time that were obviously influenced by that, right? And one of these was a book called Einstein's Dreams by someone who is a physicist in his day job, Alan Lightman, right? And so both of these books take the form of a bunch of little vignettes that are 3 or 4 pages each that explore some different idea that is a little bit absurdist or somehow obviously not the case, right? Like not literal explorations and not logical explorations. So in Invisible Cities, you know, there are cities where I'm not going to remember any of them well enough to like do justice, but you know, there's a city where every point above, it's like on the water, right? Like Venice. And every point of the city above the water has a corresponding point below. But it's also conflated with the reflection in the water. And like people are spying on each other and there are no secrets because from every point of the city, you can see every other point by looking in the reflection. I'm completely butchering it, but it's things like that. It's things that like don't exactly map to reality 100%. Right. The one that my company is named after, which of course I remember the best, is about, it's a city built by just looking up at the stars and seeing what the structure and the architecture is. And like, okay, let's copy that down here. And it always seems to be perpetually under construction and never completed. Right?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which is maybe a little bit of a bad omen when you...
That's great.
Yeah.
But appropriate for a game development.
Sadly.
Life cycle, yeah.
Sadly. And then Einstein's Dreams was like that, but different. It was, you know, many people know the story that Albert Einstein was a lowly, not particularly respected patent clerk before he did all his good stuff. And Einstein's Dreams is about him going home every day after the office and doing his physics at home and like just falling asleep, thinking about what is the answer to how it could be that light behaves.
Right.
On the one hand, this is like maybe there are different topologies to the universe. If there's a fourth dimension, what is it and how it behaves?
Yeah.
But it's also used it's like transposed onto, let's say, the idea dimension of like what people are and how they behave and like how their relationships go and stuff, right? And so in a certain kind of universe, maybe light goes kind of slow and that makes everything cold and people are cold to each other or something. Again, I'm butchering it. But like that's the basic idea. And
so it's sort of like a very like microcosmic thing where all the different parts are exhibiting the same sorts of change. So we make one change, but we kind of pretend that change ripples through everything, even if it wouldn't necessarily make quite logical physical sense that was true.
Yeah. Sometimes it varies a little bit.
Okay.
What I would say is that there's a constant use of laws of physics in an analogical way, like to make analogies with like ways that behavior could be. And sometimes that's more literal and sometimes it's less literal.
I see.
Now that even, it's very clear to me now, and maybe it even was then, but that actually owes a lot to another set of Calvino stories called the Cosmic Comics stories.
Okay.
Which is very explicitly about that too. It's like, so one of the early Cosmic Comics stories is like, there's a guy who's just like rotating in space around, like he's in a certain part of the galaxy, and his life is just many rotations of the galaxy.
Okay.
And he's very alone. And once in a while he passes maybe a mark that somebody else made, and he wonders like, what is this and who made it and where did it come from, and
all right,
that kind of a thing. Or another one is, it's at many different scales. So another one of the stories is, you could imagine the moon being much closer to the Earth and with a more eccentric orbit, such that sometimes it comes a lot closer and sometimes it's further. And gravity's a little bit different, so that like maybe the ground kind of melts up like cheese a little bit. And there's like an expedition where it comes so close at a certain time that like we're gonna cross and we're gonna go to the moon by like throwing ropes up there and like climbing up there, right? It's that kind of story, and they're very entertaining, and I recommend them to anyone who's interested, because they're all very readable, because the stories are often very short and they have an enjoyable idea that they get to very quickly. But all of this, you know, I had read as much Calvino as I could get my hands on, and all of that was influential on what Braid was, although don't blame him if you don't like the text in the game, because it's very different from anything he would have written, right? Part of what I was consciously doing is like not copying, right? Like, let's make this its own thing, even though it's heavily influenced. But so all that was flying around sort of in my mind at some point. Like, I wanted to do a game version of what I liked about these stories, right?
Why is it like a 2D platformer from like, because, you know, there are many things you could have done. You could have done something more like a top-down sort of thing, or you could have decided it should have been in 3D, or you could have, so there was something that made you pick that. Was that just, hey, a random first guess and then it stuck? Or were you like, there's a reason?
There are two reasons, two lines of reasoning that came together. One was, hey, when I first went into games industry, didn't even feel like the industry at the time, but doing this bolt action stuff, we did some really hard, challenging thing, and we only had 2 programmers. Like, imagine anyone in the year 2022 saying, I've got a 2-person programming team. We're going to build our own game engine that doesn't even use the graphics API, and it's going to be drop in, drop out, client server, narrow bandwidth action game, and we're going to make it in like a year or 2 years. It's like nobody these days would even try that, and like we somehow did it without even being in games.
So I get getting 3D out of the mix, but now there are many different types of 2D games. There's top down, there's isometric, there's
let me go back to that for a second, right? Because so like I said, I'd had a hard time firstly with bolt action, but we made a game. We made several iterations of it. It shipped to people. It was grueling, but we did it. And we were poor all the time and all that. After that, like I said, I was kind of burned out. I worked on other projects like Gallstaff, and there was probably other 3D stuff before Gallstaff. And like everything I did was trying to be 3D in some way. You know, the air guitar game was trying to parse 3D space, right? Like that's even harder. I definitely noticed the pattern. And you know, so Happy Cake, for example, as we discussed, was completed.
Also
and
3D.
3D. It was a lot of work. We got it done, but also the delta between that and a game that I would have liked was like still pretty big, right? And so I had a good taste for how hard 3D was. I knew that I could do it, but I also knew that it was going to take a lot of time and energy to do it, both technically, firstly, but also in terms of design. Just getting things to feel good in 3D is harder. Solving issues like, oh, there's just visibility problems here, or collision doesn't feel good, or whatever it is. Those are all easier just from a design standpoint in 2D than 3D.
I see.
Right? And so what I was saying to myself was, I would have envisioned that I would have done a big, groundbreaking, meaningful game. I was about to say important, but I don't know what important means. And I don't think I would have said it that way. But like, I wanted to really make my contribution to games. And I hadn't made a game that was like that yet.
Okay.
Right. So Happy Cake didn't ship to anybody. The Bolt Action game was played by a 3 or 4 digit number of people.
Right.
And then didn't continue after that.
Right.
So it's like, when am I going to do this thing? And what do I do to maximize the probability that this time this project succeeds, right? And there were many things. I was like, it's time to get serious and stop playing around on all these little projects. Now, we've talked through a lot of the consulting that I did. We talked through a few of the projects that I did, but like there were a lot of little projects. And when we skimmed over like Game Developer Magazine, right? I did that for like 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
It's like 20 to 30 little projects.
Yeah.
That whole thing.
Yeah.
It was nuts.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, let's stop messing around and make a game that's really good. So firstly, eliminate technical challenge and design challenge by being 2D. Okay, what kind of 2D? There's lots of 2D games.
This is sort of the bullseye of the question, which is I wasn't quite sure how you ended up with.
Well, I already knew, like, okay, we're going to screw around with time.
Okay.
Right? At least. And maybe we're going to do this other quantum stuff. It's unclear. But what is the form of it? Well, we know from the Calvino influence, it's about going between different worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And the rules change in every world.
Right.
And that's what's cool about it. Like, maybe in this world there's superposition, right?
Right.
Maybe in this world there's time goes backwards, whatever.
Right.
But it's interesting that part of the entertainment value or the knowledge you take from the game is seeing and understanding those changes, right? How do you do that? Well, somehow you're comparing them with the baseline. If you don't have the ability to compare them, like, hey, we've got this cool superposition thing. How do you understand why the superposition is interesting and how it's cool and how it affects things? Well, you know how the things would have been without the superposition, and then you add the superposition, right? And so I was thinking, hey, the value in this game is supposed to come from the cool reality bendy stuff. If the rules of the game are really complicated, and then you apply some reality bendy stuff, you might not even know, like, how some interaction would have resulted in the vanilla one, if it's complicated. And then you're going to be uncertain and unclear. And then especially if it's a puzzle game, which I was pretty sure it was going to be.
Okay.
If it's unclear what is the local reality weirdness effect and what is the base rule set, that's a level of uncertainty that you don't want on the ground level when like trying to solve puzzles, right? That's going to mess up the puzzle solving. And so I knew all this without having designed the game at all, which just, I think, tells you that I'd been thinking about this kind of thing for years in the EGW and elsewhere, right?
Right, okay.
So what are the simple kinds of games? I just thought through them, and Mario game came to mind very quickly, right? Whereas some games in that genre have like a lot of creatures and a lot of characters with different abilities and all this stuff.
Right.
Very clearly, the prototypical Mario game is there's one monster that just goes in a straight line and you could jump on his head.
Right.
Like that's the minimum for the that genre.
Right.
And then you could dial that up. Like you could add more monsters if you want them, if you need more complexity. And so I could figure out later what is the weird stuff and then gauge based on that how much more can the game sustain.
Right.
And I knew all this before literally typing any code.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically the selection of Mario was largely driven by wanting the simplest possible visually understandable mechanic that people would just go, okay, the baseline one is obvious to me, so that when it starts getting modified, they're not like, what the heck happened? They could clearly see like, oh, right, it's this.
Yeah.
Okay.
And now you can think about some other games that are simple, like Asteroids is simple.
Right.
Robotron is simple. And it just, thinking through those, it's like, well, so the Mario game has this element of like, it's a guy, right?
Yeah.
And that brings it to a human scale. Like the Mario games, Mario's a character. And that's a little bit like the humanity in the stories that I wanted to like, I wanted to bridge to that. If you have like a little arrow-sized spaceship, you're not getting that, right?
Right.
So
was that a concrete thought you had when evaluating these?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I thought through a bunch of them. And in fact, this was probably the genesis of the idea that there were going to be a bunch of retro games in Braid as well. Of other
which we'll have
genres.
to talk about, since that did not actually happen.
That did not actually happen.
We should talk about those.
Yeah. You know, you kind of want to flesh it out and figure out the structure of the game. And if these are puzzles made out of puzzle pieces like they were at the time, you need to have enough to make a puzzle in each world.
Right.
And even if that weren't the constraint, it's still awkward maybe at a game of that size to have some areas with a lot of puzzles and some with a few. Although, again, with The Witness, I made the opposite decision, but that works better because of the structure of that game being bigger and like there was a decision.
What do you mean by the opposite decision?
Well, in Braid, it's very regular, right? There are 12 puzzle pieces in each world, right? Okay. And so if a world doesn't have 12 puzzle pieces, maybe I'm not done designing it.
I see. And
in The Witness, it was more like going into it, I see that the design space is going to be more irregular than that. So I'm simply going to avoid any structure of that kind.
Because basically you'd have to cut too many puzzles or add too many puzzles to some of the sections. If you tried to pick like the median number or something and have everything hit that, it just wasn't going to work.
Right. Even in Braid, there's probably a little bit of that. Like there are probably, if I thought harder on some worlds, there are really good puzzles that could be there, but I was done thinking about it because there were 12.
Gotcha.
Right? Yeah.
Okay.
And then the worst thing than that actually is I don't have 12, and so I need to start to make filler, right?
Right.
And that's sort of why the number is 12. It's because that was the degree to which I found that I didn't really need filler to have enough.
So maybe some world in Braid would really have liked to have been 13 or 14, but it was just better to go, okay, the world where I have the least ideas for puzzles, they hit about 12, so we're just going to call it 12, and because I want it to be regular.
Yeah, and you know, I probably made the decision for 12 provisionally before I had that verification.
I see.
But it was a guess that turned out to be okay.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Rewind was the way that I mapped bidirectional arrow of time into a concrete feature that I could type, right? So let's type the feature in, let's make it work. And it wasn't that hard, you know, given what I had, right? I don't remember exactly how long it took, but way less than the week. Right? So then I had that and I was playing around with it. And, you know, they're like, isn't that much you can do with that? Aside from, isn't it cool?
That's why I was interested in how did you get over this initial hump, right? Like,
well, there's a simple answer to that. But before that, you know, right away I was thinking about this problem of like, okay, it's interesting in the way that had been discussed on the mailing list. But you could, you know, the initial implementation of just rewind, like you can imagine what that would be if I said Mario with rewind. It's like, all right, cool. Now, there's a fundamental shift, though, that already was in place before I even decided the rewind, which is that it's not that it's a game with technical features. It's that it's a game about how those features change the gameplay. Like that was part of the Calvino-Lightman ethic that I had going in. And so the initial problem is like, okay, I have this technical feature. I have implemented it. It is rewind.
Yes.
How can the game be about rewind?
Right.
And right away I start asking questions, and you can come up with some stuff like, well, it could be a lot harder than it could be without rewind. And
right, you could just make it so that you're basically doing a tool-assisted speed run, as we would call it today.
Yes, that might not be very fun, but it is evident that things that are unfair without rewind become more fair with rewind, right?
Yes.
What else can you do? You could go forward into somewhere very dangerous that you would regret going and get information that you wouldn't have earlier in the game. Right. And then I was like, oh yeah, well, there is this game design wisdom that people have about how to design games, especially around platformers. And there's this term called leap of faith, which is taught to game designers, at least around the GDC when I was hanging out. I don't know what kids learn in school these days, but like it was a known, I didn't even ever make a platformer, but I knew leap of faith is bad because you're expecting the character to jump into somewhere that they don't know. And if they die, if there's somewhere that they die down there and somewhere that they don't, you can't expect them to know in advance. It's completely unfair. So don't make your level that way. And well, there are extremes of that. It's like maybe you die at 100% of the places. And it's like, well, how would they know that either? Maybe it's safe at 100% of the places. It's like, well, that's probably better, but like it's still not good because you're forcing them to do something that they don't know is a good move. And if there's any other pits that go off screen anywhere else in the game, you're now still, again, creating an unfair and uncertain situation. And so, well, that's not true if you have rewind. Like free rewind. And that was one of the theses in the beginning. Like I said in the Muratori talk, he was like, it should be totally free. And you were like, it should just be a feature of the system. And it's like, okay. That was one of the theses in the beginning. Like I said in the Muratori talk, or about the Muratori talk, he was like, it should be totally free. And you were like, it should just be a feature of the system. And it's like, okay. So I had the high level mission statement. I am not going to cop out by making sand a resource or whatever. I absolutely will not do that. What I am rather instead going to do is implement the thing and then change the game however is necessary. Okay, so a Mario game by itself is proven to be, it can be a good, fun game if you do the right things. Okay? So you can picture it as I start with a good, fun game that's just got lives and whatever. Okay? We know what that is. Now I mess it up by putting rewind in. It's maybe not fun. It's maybe tedious. It's maybe too easy. The knee-jerk reaction that a designer would have is like, okay, limit rewind, or you only get it during special times. I'm not going to do that. I'm instead, the only way out is through. I'm going to see rewind stays constant, and then what else about the game needs to change to make it something different. And I had to just have the faith that I would be able to find that, right? And that was, again, a very experimental gameplay mindset.
So it's sort of like flipping the like arrow of action. It's like saying, look, normally what you would do in game design is you would say, we have to modify the feature to fit the existing game design. And you're doing the opposite. You're saying, let's modify the existing game design to fit the feature.
Yes, and if you think about this in terms of exploring the space of game design, then obviously you don't want to retreat back into what is known, but that's what almost everybody does all the time.
And if you're modifying the feature, you're sort of by definition saying that's what you're going to do because you're keeping the other side, which is the gameplay, constant.
And I believe, I don't remember a lot of what that conversation on the mailing list was, but I bet some of it was like that. Like, well, you know, you ruin consequence and you make the game too easy and all that stuff. But you could mitigate that in the following ways. And absolutely nobody said, design a whole new game around rewind.
Just like make consequence not the important part or whatever. Yeah. Okay.
On this same initial 1 week thing, I have plenty of free headspace because I'm chilling, I'm on vacation, everything's good. And I'm excited about this idea. And I've typed in the rewind code and it works by telling you what fields of entities have changed. And so there's an outer loop that's for all entities in the world. And there's an inner loop that's for all fields in this entity. And transmit that information to the rewind buffer or whatever. you don't exactly know where this idea comes from, but it's a very simple idea that I just have. Maybe I woke up with it, or maybe I was just chilling, but I was like, like if there was a bug or something, or maybe I could just do it intentionally, just some of those objects are not visited by that loop.
Right.
Right. And then that gives me two classes of things. It gives me things that always go forward in time and things that rewind in time. And right away, like even as soon as I have that idea, like I don't know what to do with it yet.
Yeah.
But it's like, oh, that is the kind of cool and weird and expanding the rewind idea that I'm looking for. Right.
It feels, just as you say it, to be very in line with like the Calvino Invisible Cities kind of thing, where it's like, oh, there's these kind of like different permutations of things happening as I go through.
Yes.
And I don't know the Einstein Dream one, but I assume that was kind of similar. Like there would be, it's the kind of thing you would see in that kind of work, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's weird reality, basically.
Yeah.
But it still has all the character or all the, like, it's still a system with well-defined rules, in fact.
Right.
Right? So as soon as I had that idea, that was pretty easy to put in. And then as soon as I had that idea, I was like, what else can I do with the rewind? And I know that I did 3 worlds in that initial beta. And I think it was literally what's now world 2, 3, 4, right?
Okay.
So world 2 is rewind.
Right.
World 3 is rewind with objects that are exempt to rewind.
Right.
And world 4 is time is tied to space. And I think there was just like 1 level of that or 2 at the end.
Right.
In fact, I think it was t equals x and then t equals y, which there's no t equals y in the final game.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like the first time you read Calvino, you were just thinking it would be cool to make a game like this sometime.
No, not at all.
It was actually much closer to the actual time of making Braid that you first started thinking like, hey, it would be neat to do something like that, those books that I read.
Yeah, and specifically what I was thinking was, well, in a story, you can just sort of postulate whatever the laws of physics are. Like, okay, the moon comes really close and it pulls the ground up and stuff, right? Doesn't exactly work that way in a game, especially like the more systemic the game is, the more you kind of can't just cheat that sort of thing. You have to more make a system that exhibits those properties. Right. And that to me is more magical.
Right.
Right. I was like, there's something cool. And if it's hard, it seems very hard, but if you can do it, it's a little bit more groundbreaking than just doing a story about the thing. Right.
Yeah.
In the field of games, it's a thing that very few people had done. Now, there were other games that did analogies of this sort, right? Okay. So one of the earliest ones was Rod Humble's game, The Marriage, which I had shown at EGW, which like there's 2 people in this relationship and they're just colored squares on the screen and you move them around and some stuff happens. And, and then Jason Rohrer actually had done these 2 games, Passage and Gravitation. I think They also engage in this kind of analogy where there's a system of rules and those rules are expressive about the situation that the game's about, right? It's not just the plot and the fiction that the game is about, but the rules of the universe that are being set up are expressive of what the game is about. And so I wanted to do something like that. And I wanted to do it about physics because quantum mechanics, for example, is pretty weird, as is relativity, right? And I thought it would be fun to take that weirdness and instead of, conflating it with human scale things in a fiction kind of way, like those stories do, let's conflate it with human level things by just making the phenomena happen on a human scale.
Right.
And then just like seeing what happens and seeing how to make a game out of that. And that'll be fun and interesting. Like, if there's quantum superposition or something and something's at multiple places until the waveform gets localized, that's one idea, right? Or one thing that comes up in physics a lot is time being bidirectional, right? So, which is even true back in Newtonian physics, but also in relativity and stuff. And so what does that mean? How do you make a game where time is bidirectional? It's challenging because it seems like almost you can't make anything happen.
Right.
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 Because it would have to be a completely pre-recorded sequence for you to go forward and backward. And so what does that mean? And so those questions were just in the air.
I see. And they're kicking around in your head, growing over time, somewhere in the 2003, 2004 kind of.
Yeah, it may not have even been that. It may have been just the few months before.
So like 2004-ish times. Then,
yeah. But you can see like how these are they're both difficult questions to answer.
Yes.
And also not very actionable until you have a good answer.
Right. Yeah, you're not really going to be able to do much until you get something to hold on to.
Yeah. But then, so there's this mailing list conversation that happens. There was some discussion that probably started with Prince of Persia: Sands of Time had come out or something.
Yes.
And so you guys were talking about rewind in games. And to my recollection, maybe I contributed to this conversation a little bit, but I was not really one of the people with the strongest opinions in it. But there was a lot of conversation about like, did this game do a good job? And then what does rewind ability mean for games going forward? Right. And what I remember you saying was, this is obviously a technological feature like rewind was for VCRs.
Yeah.
So it should just be in most or all games as something that you can just do. Right. But it's like other people were like, well, you can't do that because you're removing consequence from games. Right.
Yes.
And consequence is important. And like the conversation kind of went back and forth on that for a bit. But I was like, nobody really implemented anything. Right.
Right.
And so then I was on vacation and I was thinking about this physics thing, being able to rewind maps onto this bidirectional time thing that I was thinking about. It's sort of the same idea from a different perspective. Right. And so I kind of been wanting to make this Calvino Lightman inspired game. So I started to have an idea like, okay, this is actionable. If I actually program rewind, then it's both contributing to that discussion because with an implementation, but also answering this question of like, what can I do about this physics game that's actionable? Now, even at that time, I didn't think the whole game would be rewind. It was just like, here's some manifestation of one of the lines of the game. And I did, because Invisible Cities is many different cities and whatnot, I was thinking it would be a lot of different worlds. And one of them would be the rewind world. But like another one was like the quantum superposition world or something. Right?
Yes.
Another way to phrase the thing that you were saying is like, look, this is really fundamental. It should just be there. It shouldn't be like a weird game design gimmick. Like for people who don't know Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, which I'm sure most people these days don't, it had sand that you would use to rewind time, and you had a certain number of charges. And when you ran out of rewind charges, which you could pick up on the map, then you start losing lives when you die. Right.
And also for people whose main like touch point for this is playing Braid, when we say rewind, we don't really mean Braid rewind. It was like a really crappy like 10 seconds of rewind tops or something.
And like, it was not a technically good, like the sound didn't go backwards.
And the animations were all screwed up.
Yeah.
And it was very limited, so you could not like rewind all the way back to the beginning of a long level or anything like that.
No. It was like they had some ring buffer with character positions in it, and then they made the rest up or something.
It was not really the kind of gameplay thing that it is in Braid, where it's expected to always work and always go all the way back and all that stuff.
But so also with the story stuff, it's like you read some words about time or something, what's going on with this character or that character, before you experience the gameplay, right? And so you don't really even know what to connect to. But after you finish the world, if you were interested enough to go back and read it some more, you then have both halves of the thing and you could maybe see correspondences, right?
Right.
And then similarly, there's structural parallelism between the worlds and stuff, and just things about them that you could notice. Like, on the one hand, I expect a great many people would just walk past the story things and not care about them very much.
Not even read them, potentially.
And that's why it's designed the way it is as opposed to the original thing. Because in the original thing where it puts it on the screen and it's like, the point of this screen is only for you to read this text and then press spacebar to continue. You almost have to disrespect the game a little bit to not read the text. You know what I mean? Like if I'm playing a modern game and like I'm mashing the button through all the dialogue scenes that I don't care about, I'm kind of disrespecting the game.
Yes.
But I have to in order to get to the part that I want to play, right?
Yes.
So here, it's a little bit of a middle ground there where, you know, you do have to walk across the room and you incidentally walk past these pages, but like the function of the room is also just to be the playable menu that contains
the linking
doors.
room, yeah.
And so it's not only the text, and so you kind of don't have to totally disrespect the game. If I were to redesign Braid now, which I'm not going to do for this anniversary edition, but like I might even make it, like right now, it's still a little bit passive aggressive, or that's not the right word. It's a little bit closer to the original thing in that the story text is always between you and the doors. And I might mix that up a little bit. Right. There's an analog dial of how strongly am I suggesting that maybe you want to read the text, right? And it's in the middle somewhere.
I mean, you could imagine a design that went very far in that direction where it's like the house itself contains all of the linking and the text somehow, so that you literally never go to a screen that is just about having text there as the main thing that's in it, right?
Yeah. You know, there's just some other things too, like the ratio of, okay, so you go onto the cloud screen, right? And the title of that world is big letters at the top and always visible. Like you don't have to even go to a podium. So aside from the doors, the function of the cloud screen, just the fact that it's the cloud screen again, the first time, of course, you don't know what it is, but the second time and thereafter, it established a pattern.
Yeah.
So you get that. You get the title, which is a hint about what's coming and sort of tells you what this world is called. And that's there before you even go to a podium, right? And so when you go to the podium and the story text comes up, it's like, okay, maybe you're interested and maybe you're not, but those other things already provided some value or interest as well, right? And so it's just this balancing act. I might make it a little bit differently today even, but it's okay. You know, I feel good about that. I mean, it's the first puzzle game that I ever designed. First single player game I ever designed. So, you know. So I didn't want it to be like a story-based game in the way lots of games are, where it's about the narrative or something. Those people drove me nuts, like even back then.
Right.
But I like the idea, okay, so it's some kind of hybrid. I want to have some writing and I want to have some gameplay. What does that look like? Well, you know, there are illustrated storybooks, some of which are for kids, but even for like young adults and adults, the further back in time you go, the more you see like things that are illustrated, right? And then even old religious texts were often just like illustrated, right?
Yes.
Here's Jesus dragging the cross or whatever. Like that's a thing. Yeah. And so I was like, okay, what if it's like that, an illustrated storybook, but it's kind of flipped around where the text takes the place of the illustration in that there's like less of it and it's there more for color and flavor. And then the gameplay is like the text in the storybook is the main part, right? Is most of what you're experiencing and playing most of the time. I don't know. Also ergonomically though, if there's going to be text as an introduction, like I liked it better as an introduction in the beginning of each world to help set it up than like coming in the middle or whatever. Right. Now, if I were text phobic, sometimes people do things that are inherently contradictory, right? They do that all the time. Okay. If I wanted text in the game but was scared of text in the game, I would put it as little blurbs in the middle, right? Or have little characters who would tell you backstory. Right. Like before I'd even started Braid, I think a very popular indie game was like Cave Story, right? Right. And it was one of these like linear story-based adventures where you meet characters and they have dialogue that gives you information about the world. So that was very clearly a model that I could have done. Yes. But I wanted this to be an art game, right? That was another one of the there were a lot of high-level parameters of what I was trying to do, right?
Yeah.
I wanted it to be an art game, but unapologetically an art game, right? Because I'd been thinking about art games and experimental games and all this stuff, and I was seeing that certain classes of things were not being made. I don't think this idea was there from the very beginning, but at some point I had some idea that like I was going to have a little bit of a shock surprise ending because like Mario games are kind of for kids and are infantilizing and all of these things.
Okay.
And if you like go very mature or whatever at the end, that would be a way to, I don't know, be surprising and show that it's an art. Like, look, who would do something like this in a video game?
Right. Like they cook the man for dinner at the end of the movie or whatever. It's like, now you're pretty sure this isn't for kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that had been the premise for a while, and there were versions of the story that did that for a while. And the thing is, I just decided eventually that like isn't that good of an idea, right?
Okay.
It's just like I want to do something better than that. That is a relatively, how would I say it? Like if you're looking around and you're saying there's all this kid stuff, and so I'm going to do something that's not kid stuff, that's still a thing that someone who isn't totally an adult would be concerned with. Because if you are an adult, it's no big deal.
Okay.
You know, you go online and you get insulted by people all the time, and you can tell who they are by what they do.
Right.
So like once in a while, people say to me like, you know, I say something that they don't like, and they're like, oh my God, you're so immature. This is ridiculous. Right. And I'm like, wait, how old do you think I am? Because I'm not worried about being immature right now.
Right. Yeah.
That's just not a thing that's on the table for me. But because you think it is, you're probably in your 20s or something, right? And I just know this, right? And so it's kind of like that. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I'm going to have this game not be totally kid stuff, and I'm going to do an adult-ish thing. And that just seemed a little bit childish at some point. And I think I knew it was the whole time, and I just didn't have a better idea.
Interesting.
So, for example, The Witness is a pretty damn adult game.
Yeah.
Like, I can't really think of something that's more of a game for adults than that.
Okay.
Aside from like a very long, boring Sudoku game or something,
right? Okay, yeah.
But it isn't that way because of anything gimmicky. It's just the sensibility, right? And so the problem was my conception of how this thing would end was a little bit gimmicky because it had a little bit of like M. Night Shyamalan to it that was not helpful.
I don't think I ever saw this twist ending that you're talking about. Maybe.
The point being, though, I had some plan of what the arc was.
Okay.
And then eventually I decided that's not a good arc.
Okay.
I am disappointed with this arc. And so I'm going to do something that I am less disappointed in.
Mm-hmm.
It is also going to be less comprehensible to most people.
I see.
But you know what? I'm just going to do what I want to do.
It's my game, my rules.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened there. And I was very aware while doing it that it's going to be even less linear conceptually. It's going to be even harder to read as a conventional story. And I didn't care. I was just like, look, this is what I want to do.
How did that idea develop that there was going to be sort of distinct two things, text and the game?
It was baked into the idea at the start.
Okay.
For reasons, right? One, I kind of wanted to write something again. I had written things way in the past, and I was like, I could do something here.
Right.
It was going to be much more of a constrained writing exercise.
Okay.
So part of all of this stuff, so the Oulipo, which we mentioned,
yes,
is all about constrained writing according to rules
yes.
or heuristics or algorithms, right?
Right.
And then like these specific books that I was taking inspiration from were like that.
Right.
And so I kind of liked the idea of there's gameplay in the different worlds, and that puts constraints on what the writing is. That's one direction of constraints. And then there's an orthogonal direction that's just from writing to writing. Like the intros to these different worlds can have structural parallelism in some way. In the end, there was probably at least one too many constraints on it. And it, like, the writing quality suffered from it probably, but it's fine. But like, I was just interested in that idea. And then also, even before I know it's rewind, there's this idea that doing something in gameplay is more difficult than in fiction, because in fiction fiction just depends on how good you are at rhetoric in some sense.
Right.
Like, once there was a world where everybody walked around on their hands, and that's just how it is.
Right.
And in games, you have to deal with what that means.
Right. Yeah.
Walking on their hands is not that good of an idea, but like, you open a door and it goes to another universe or whatever. Like, that's an idea where in fiction you can say whatever, but you're describing some rules all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And in games, you have to make those work consistently for it to be a certain class of game, a system-oriented game. Now, of course, whenever I say this, there's always like, well, it could be like the old adventure games where there's just if statements, right?
Right. So you don't really implement the system. You just implement the like particular beats you cared about, and everything else is just not there.
Yeah. But even those are better when they feel systemy. And the way that people figure out, so like Planetfall, for example.
Yes.
Or a Starcross actually is even more. Starcross has some objects that are pretty systemy. And the way that you solve the puzzles is you know how they behave, and you use that to engineer the solution. And then the if statements happen to correctly implement the behavior that you wanted.
Right.
Right. And so it's like you're pretending the system is there, both as the player and the author, right? But as you go more forward in time and games are more capable, it's like, hey, there's more of an actual system.
Right.
And the system is more complex and nuanced. And I was very interested in that.
When you first start designing this game, you went on vacation and you found that like one thing kind of led to another, and very quickly it built out to something approximating worlds 2, 3, and 4. You even have the text in there, not the final text, but text that's like sort of similar.
Well, and the text is, we could clarify, it's in a different form than you see it in the final game, right? In the final game, it's in a somewhat interactive screen where you run by some books on podiums and it changes the text between stuff. Back then, it was more like the minimal thing you would have to put text into the game. So there would be, before each level, just a screen that's, not in the game. It's just a different mode. And it's like press spacebar to start the level or whatever, but there's a bunch of text. And in general, it was, all the text for that world on the screen. So it was like a bigger text dump, and you couldn't really go back and read it if you skipped it. And all these things that you would expect from a relatively short amount of effort on a game.
So the text in Braid is something that was revised a bunch of times. The actual last time I played Braid before its release, it had substantially different text than the text that was actually released. So it was getting revised a bunch of times.
Like through development.
Throughout the development.
For sure.
And during the course of this interview, you actually said you think the text maybe wasn't as good as it could have been because, quote unquote, you were trying too hard to make it good, actually. You said that. I don't know what you mean by that. So maybe you could unpack some of that. How did you develop the text? Like, what were you sort of trying to do there? And what did you mean when you said maybe you tried too hard or something? I don't know. I really don't know what you meant. So
there's just a problem that happens if... Okay, so to relate this back to design, broadly speaking, right? One of the best skills as a game designer is to know what something looks like as somebody who just sees it for the first time. Where are their eyes being drawn? What do they think about all these things, right?
You did mention that multiple times.
It's a little bit similar with writing, probably, except I have not clocked nearly as many hours writing as I have designing games. And so there's this thing that can happen if you're really thinking hard about how to make writing do a lot of things functionally. And like, how do I do this with it? How do I do that to it? How do I connect it to this other part? How do I make it short enough, but also still have some idea in it? And two things happen. One is, unless you do a really good job refreshing yourself, you really early on stop seeing it as somebody does when they see it for the first time. And this becomes very hard. So you just see like little tweaky things about it and whatever, right? And that for sure happened.
Okay.
If I make a game, I know that what people see first helps set their expectations of what the whole thing is about. When it came to the text in Braid, because I was so looking at it up close, I probably failed to account for certain things. So for example, the World 2 text is the first text that people see. And because it's first, it sets expectations thematically for what the game is about and what the point of things are and stuff. Whereas that's actually, you know, I revised that one a bunch, probably too much. And to me, I was more setting it up parallel to the other worlds because that's the structure of the game, right? And not correctly accounting for the degree to which the first thing sets the tone. And to be honest, the World 2 text is my least favorite. It's the one that I think is like the lowest quality and the one that I was never as happy with. And so to date, I haven't revised any of the text for the anniversary edition, but if I did, it would probably be the World 2 text, both for this functional reason and for the fact that like I never was totally happy with it. And some of this unhappiness came from, you know, like when you're writing, being as brief as you can while doing the thing that you're trying to do is generally good advice, right?
Yes.
I think that in some cases, I was trying to be a little bit too brief while trying to do too many things. And what that manifests as is you read something and it just seems weird or like it doesn't totally connect. Because if I'd added another half of a sentence or whatever, it would have made more sense. But I cut that half of a sentence because I was very worried about the thing being too long. So like actually
some of the color, like it becomes more stilted if it's super compact.
Yeah, and in fact, that's what happened with my game developer articles is they became unreadable because they were forced to fit within a certain footprint. And I think to a little bit of an extent that happened here, especially with things like the World 2 text and whatnot. So if I were to give myself writing advice back at that time, it would be to not be so worried. Like, look, if people are going to read these at all, it's because they have an attention span.
And the people who don't are just going to run by them anyway.
Yeah, and so don't worry that much about optimizing the length. Because then especially, like, weird stuff happens, right? So, for example, if you're trying to write and you're trying to be concise and clear, one of the things that you would do that's, you know, most people will give you this writing advice is to cut superfluous, like, adjectives and adverbs. Because even though they seem to you to be helping set the tone and stuff, they weigh something and it becomes clumsy if you just have a lot of them, right? And they take it longer to get to the point that you're actually getting to, right? The problem is as you try to make things short, like if I want to cut out an entire sentence that would have brought up some concept briefly, right? And it's like, oh, I want to shorten this so it doesn't have that. But I still want a little bit of a connection to what I'm going to talk about in something shorter than a sentence. I'm going to add back an adjective or an adverb, right? Which then has, like, that's problematic for the reasons just discussed. And so I think some of that was happening as well, where if I had allowed myself a longer total length of text, it just wouldn't have suffered from me mashing it down, I think. I had been in person earlier at Brian Moriarty's lecture at the GDC, The Secret of Psalm 46, which is one of his more famous lectures. And if you're curious about that, it exists in its entirety in The Witness, which you can, although it's hard to get to. But if you get to it, you get to listen to the whole thing.
Yes. If you're serious about it, you will beat the entire Witness and watch it there.
Yes. If you're a gamer, so one of the things that he was saying in that speech is that like things that are powerful, like things that are fundamental are generous, right? Mm-hmm. I'm going to paraphrase really badly because it's been a while since I listened to it, but like the world is just generous there's like a lot of air for you to breathe, and there's like a lot of surprise and a lot of and part of what he was expressing in that talk was frustration with sort of the limited thinking of game developers, right? And the way that I make you care about stuff is artificial scarcity, right? Which is weird though, because he's also talking a lot about this masquerade thing, which sort of is artificial scarcity. There's something in that talk that I never fully resolved for myself about exactly what side he was on, right? And this isn't the exact phrase, but he says something like, profound things are generous. The magic is right there.
Yes.
If what people want is invincibility, just give it to them. I really liked that speech, and that had been floating around in my head also. Like again, I didn't know how to action that. I mean, obviously you could make a platformer where the character is invincible, but like, okay, why is that good?
Right.
Right. And so those were all the seeds of this thing, and they came together at this time. I had an idea of an experience that I wanted the player to have at the start of the game.
Okay.
Just an art thing. Like, wouldn't it be nice if the following, right? And you see yourself silhouetted and you have this like simple moment. And that includes all sorts of even pragmatic things, like the game not booting to a menu and just booting to this scene that almost could act like a screensaver until you start playing the game.
And there's not like 50 logos that come up.
Zero
cetera,
logos,
right?
Yeah. You know, the first thing a lot of people want to do is put their company logo that nobody's ever heard of or cares about, and that's the first thing you see. And I'm like, no. And in fact, Witness was the same way. It boots, and then you're in the hallway.
Yep.
Yeah. The other thing, and it's related, but a little bit meta, is because my agenda was for this to be an art game, and not just to be an art game, but to show other designers and players, like this is a way that games can be, that games usually aren't being, right? So it was to make a point, kind of like the game starts up, you see a thing, it's not like Mario.
Right.
You're like, what exactly is going on?
Yeah.
And it's a statement. This experience you're about to have is different from the ones that you are used to. Like, I wanted to hit people with that right away, but in a way that was also beautiful and nice.
Okay.
So that was a very early idea.
Okay.
Like those initial builds of the game that I sent to you guys didn't have this. It was just like you're in level 1 or whatever.
But you had wanted it at that time.
Well, I don't know, but relatively soon after, once I started thinking about how do I put all this together, like that came in there. So the house, well, I'd had this idea that if it's a puzzle game, I think the idea that you would be able to trivially run through the levels came much later. But before that, it was like, okay, these levels are going to have puzzles. I had done enough looking at games to see that if you have a very linear structure and you have puzzles, people get stuck on a puzzle and then they can progress no further in the game.
Right.
And that's terrible. They get mad at the game. There's plenty of enjoyable times that they would be able to have that you're not letting them have.
Yep.
And you're not even giving them that much of a chance to figure out the puzzle, because banging your head against one thing is not that great, even for just processes of thought, right?
Right,
If what helps you solve the puzzle is better facility with the universe of this game and how the rules work and all that, then like if I just give you more experience with the game in different contexts, then you're better armed to come back and solve whatever you were stuck on. So all of this led me to think, okay, we want a structure where if there are a bunch of worlds with different physics in them, Like, we probably should introduce them roughly in some sequence, but who's to say you have to solve them in sequence or even play them in sequence, right? And so it's deliberately different from a book that way. Although, again, books like Dictionary of the Khazars are deliberately nonlinear, but it's very rare in a book to do that.
Right, most books are linear.
Like Choose Your Own Adventure is deliberately nonlinear.
Right, yeah.
But this was a way of trying to make the puzzle game good. Okay, so if it's kind of nonlinear and you can go to things in whatever order, how do you know when you're done? How do you get to the end? I can't just put the end after World 6 or whatever, because what if you haven't finished the other ones?
Right.
So there's got to be something gating you from the ending.
Right.
And it would be nice if that was something where you could see your progress incrementally. Like, you could imagine there's just some door that's locked until everything else is done and then it opens. And that is functionally what is there. But I came up with this thing where, like, you know, the different ladders are there based on what worlds you finished, and you can climb higher, although you can't really get to anything. So that feels a little bit better. And if you've solved them discontinuously, there'll be a gap where you can't climb, but then you see the other ladder out there, and you get this feeling of progress. You get the visual feedback of progress, and there's this mystery of, like, what's in that attic.
Right.
Right. And you get the whole game to think about that, because you see the attic at the beginning.
Right.
And I mean, if you poke around, and at some point, probably long before the end, because you end up coming back to this house between every world.
Right.
And every time you quit the game and restart it, you're back in the house. And so you probably poked around at some point and you're like, oh, what's up there?
Yes.
And I never put a sign saying you're trying to get into the attic, right?
Yeah.
But it's natural to want to know.
Yes.
And so that all seemed like a good way to structure it.
Just so we're clear on what a reward is, though, because somebody who is not necessarily familiar with exactly what's going on in all of these types of designs is the fact that in Braid, I put together this puzzle and then the ladder to the attic goes over, right? Like, why isn't that a reward? Or so can you be a little bit more specific, just for anyone who was unclear on what those two things were? What to you differentiates this sort of thing into two categories, where one is a reward and the other is actually just part of the game design?
Well, we can, again, we can turn a dial here.
Okay.
And so the thing that you're talking about with the ladders, it is technically a reward. It's a muted one, right? It's an acknowledgement of progress where you expect the feeling of satisfaction comes internally from the player, right? Like, oh, I see that I made this progress that probably I had planned out. Like the first one, you don't really know what's going on. But after one or two, you're like, okay, I want the third one now.
Right.
And then you see that you got the third one now, and you're like, okay, this is good. And you decide that it's good, right?
Yeah.
Now, you can turn a dial about how extrinsic it is. So the one that's there right now is almost completely intrinsic, in that we're not taking very many steps to get you hyped, right?
I want to say the camera doesn't even really pan to it or anything.
No, it doesn't.
Just
you just
kind
climb
of
up there
happens.
and you see it.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of camera pans. I almost never do them.
Yeah.
It takes extra programming. Whereas, interestingly, so that game company, which is a different game company, they're very concerned with having people feel specific emotions, and they do camera pans all the time.
Okay.
So that's an interesting difference that you can think about. So what else could I do? Well, I could. So when you get a ladder in place is when you put the last puzzle piece in and put the puzzle in the frame, right? I could do a camera pan at that time. That's a little more, it's still utilitarian, because it's like, I want to just make sure that you notice this thing, but it's also making a bigger deal out of it, right? Well, instead of a camera pan, you could do a camera pan with like a cool sound effect, and like, maybe it materializes in place, right? And that's cooler. You're making a bigger moment out of it.
You play Flight of the Valkyries.
Well, again, you can keep going. Like instead of it materializing, maybe it materializes with like gold stars that shoot off like fireworks or whatever. Maybe the little dinosaur guy and his friends have a little parade around your character and then walk up to the thing, right? And they're like tooting on the horns and stuff.
Or Bloopy.
Yes.
Bloopy could come out.
Bloopy could come out and say, congratulations, that is the 4th ladder, which is even better than the 3rd ladder. You're way better at this game than you've ever been before. And there's only 2 ladders left. And I'm sure it's going to be so amazing when you get that last ladder, right? This is more and more extrinsic. And there are multiple dimensions to it. Like there's, you know, shooting off the fireworks and making a big deal out of it. But there's also like rhetoric, like, you're so strong because you beat that boss.
Yeah.
You're such a smart person for figuring out that puzzle. And games do all of these things.
Yes.
Right? And, well, if you look at the games on the phone, they're one certain way.
Yeah.
Right? And they're that way for a reason. And this is a little bit of an interesting thing then, because it's really not possible to dial the extrinsic part all the way to 0. Like there's always trace amounts of it, even.
Right, because you didn't have to prevent the person from going to the attic. They could have just gone to the attic at the beginning of the game. So the fact that you chose to prevent them from going to the attic makes getting to the attic a reward by definition.
Well, but also I made it bigger than it had to be. So for example, you know, I put these ladder segments, we work to make them look a little bit good. Like they're in a sequence that you can understand and that's supposed to create drama toward the ending. It could instead be there's a ladder that goes all the way. I mean, we could just let you in, right? But even before that, you could climb up and you walk in front of the door and it says locked :
2
out of 6 puzzles.
Right.
And that's way less extrinsically motivating even than what we're already doing. It's also just less classy and it makes the game less nice and all these things. And so that's my point, is that these things are correlated and it's really, really hard to get them even anywhere near 0 and still have a good game. At the very first level of World 2, there's a few tutorial-ish things that are just like, here's some puzzle pieces that are kind of easy that you do various things to get, just to show you the kind of things you do in this game, right? One of the very first ones was, there's one of these platforms that goes, I don't know if this was in the version that you guys play, it might have been.
You mean the first like alpha build?
Yeah.
Okay.
There was like a platform, you know, at the very end of what I'm about to say, there's a puzzle piece that you can see and you're like, I need to get that.
Okay.
So there's a platform with a gap you have to jump across.
Right.
To a narrower platform.
Right.
With another gap to a narrower platform. With another gap to a narrower platform with another gap. And there's like 9 platforms increasingly narrow. And like the last ones are absurdly thin compared to your character.
Yes.
Which is kind of bad because like even at that point, it's like you would stand on a platform or not based on whether the center point of your character was located on the span of the platform, right? So it's like, are you supposed to read the game's mind there? But that was like funny because there's no way you would do that in another game, right?
Right.
That ended up getting taken out. In part, like Microsoft complained about it, but I was also like, yeah, that's been in the game since really early on, and it's no longer quite the quality of experience that I want to have.
Microsoft complained about it?
They did a thing, so in early 2008, when the game was getting close to kind of being done, they did a whole frickin' playtest lab thing about it, right?
Oh, okay.
And they decided to tell me, here is how you should change your game based on the results of the playtest lab. And I said, well, this would make more sense if I could see the raw data. And they were like, no, we're not going to send you any data. I, as the producer, am just going to give you my opinion about what you should do. And I was like, no.
Okay.
But I did change that one thing because it was like, you know, sometimes you already kind of know something's not that good. And it's like, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now, when it comes to something like the World 2 puzzle, I'm playing a little bit of a game with myself there.
Okay.
Because that isn't about time stuff.
Right.
To me, it came a little bit later in development after this other pattern was established. And so to me, it's a pattern break sequentially in time.
Okay.
Even though to the player, it totally isn't.
I see.
And I know that, but there's something, when you work on something for years, you can get really complicated about it. And at some point, I like the weird existential fact that this is a game about us having different experiences sequentially. The chronological sequence to the player is different from the chronological sequence to the designer. And this thing being there early for the player is some vestige of that phenomenon. And absolutely nobody is ever going to get that.
Well, if I may...
But I know it. Right?
Yeah, like, is it a little bit like when someone's telling you a story and they say, but I'm getting ahead of myself? Is it kind of like that, where it's like, oh, I know all of the stuff because I already know the whole thing I'm telling you.
I made this game. I know what all the things are.
And so I started to say something that would only really make sense if you also had known the whole thing. And then I'm like, oh, wait, okay, sorry, yeah. So it's this this little thing coming out that's like, well, I already know all this stuff, so trust me, this is interesting. You'll get it in a little bit.
I mean, I think the Princess Bride movie does that, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes.
Yeah. Usually that's done, though, in an audience-friendly way.
Right.
I am doing it in an audience-unfriendly
way, yeah.
So everything that I just said about that is all what I think about it.
Right.
But it also might just be my mind's way of justifying this thing that's cool that I wanted to do.
Right.
Coming up with a reason why it's okay.
Right.
There is another reason that I think is a little bit similar and may also be slightly a rationalization, which is World 2 is the world where you kind of can't do a lot. It's just rewind. The other worlds have all these elements of magic that emerge from the rule set.
Right.
And in World 2, there's like no room. There's the initial magic of like, oh, cool, I can rewind.
Right.
But on the face of it, there's not room for phenomenon magic in the same way.
Right.
And so making a hole in it, like poking a hole in that universe through which the magic happens, somehow felt okay. And in fact, if that's going to happen, so that could have been in any world.
Right.
Why is it in World 2?
Right.
Which seems to even be the weirdest place to put it because it's so early in the game.
Right.
And the answer is because World 2 is where it makes the most sense in some way.
Right.
Because World 2 is so spare mechanically, so it has the most conceptual space for it. But also in the other worlds, because they're more complicated, it would be more confusing
and less special.
And less special, yeah. See, this is the thing that I always try to say, to tell people, is like, it's good to have reasons about why you do things. But like I said, most of your brain is not the reasoning part.
Right.
And a lot of it has pretty cool ideas. And if you reject them because they don't totally conform to reason, you're maybe not hitting your potential in terms of ideas. Like, what ideas can you bring to bear? However, if you don't apply reason, you're one of these random wacky artists who just is doing wacky things all the time, and that's what makes you creative, is that you're random.
Right, yes.
And that is the kind of person with whom I have fundamental personality conflicts. Like, I don't like that.
Okay.
But I do have a little bit of it, right? A little bit of it.
Right.
As the last little, like, cherry on the cake that's already very good.
Right. So a random cherry on a good cake, on a logical cake, is good. But a logical cherry on a random cake would probably not be.
Yes. Although, logical is maybe not quite the word that I would use.
Coherent, or
coherent and well-structured and high quality ingredients.
I think I get what you mean. I don't know if we've explained it well, but
no, I think that's good. And I don't think that I've ever explained this particular thing. Like I've talked to a few people about it, maybe even on the record, but I think what I just said, for anyone listening, is the best explanation that I've ever given of this thing.
Of that thing, okay.
To anyone else. This thing that we're talking about, the World 2 thing, is also the biggest mistake in the game.
Ooh,
but not for the reason that we're talking about. And I alluded to this before when we were talking about playtesting, right?
What is the biggest mistake?
The biggest mistake is the following thing.
Okay.
Everywhere in this game, the first time you see a puzzle, you can solve it.
Okay.
And
not true here.
And you don't need to gain extra powers, which you do in other, like if it's Metroid, I need a thing to get up there.
Very common,
right?
Very common.
And when people start the game, they don't know that it's not Metroid.
Right.
And so part of what the game is doing is helping you understand that it's not Metroid. Except here. Here, you can't solve the puzzle the first time you get there. And part of that had to do with me being afraid in some sense.
Afraid?
Yes, that I would blow the secret and that it would be too easy, because there are 4 puzzle pieces or something that you get in the first couple levels.
Yeah.
And if those had the necessary pieces to solve this, if you got them before you got to the puzzle, then you would be able to solve it. But if you have a few pieces and they have this highly visually conspicuous element, there's no camouflage for it. Right. You just see it right there. And maybe after doing the witness, I would have had more cojones to like try this.
Yeah.
But I didn't at that time. I was like, it just seems to me like it's not going to be good and people are just going to do it, and they're going to see what the thing is and they're going to do it, and then they're not going to enjoy it because it's just kind of obvious and meh.
I see.
Whereas if you don't know the answer and then you have a bunch of puzzle pieces and there's a bunch of visual information to look at, and then you come back to it and you're like, oh, right? Then it makes more sense. There's other things like the thing that solves it could have been in one piece, but it's in 2 pieces, right? Why? Because it was just a little too narrow and small in one piece and fiddly.
Right.
And it felt better to me to put the 2 pieces together and have a big thing. Although programmatically you can solve it with one. Like there is, like I make a little platform segment for each one. I've been speaking vaguely as though to avoid spoilers, but like it's not like we've said enough detail to tell you. Like there's an image, there's a table in the image, the painting of the World 2 puzzle, and the table looks very, very, very much like one of the platforms that you can stand on, the kind that you can jump up through, but you don't fall through, which is a platformer trope.
Yes.
And so if you realize that, it's really a precursor to the kind of thing that happened in The Witness a lot, right?
Okay.
Even some of the earlier puzzles in The Witness, like there are some trees there and they're conspicuously standing right in front of you, and they have information that you want. Spoilers, by the way. But you don't necessarily know that that's where the information is going to come from.
Right.
And part of the magic is that it's right there. So really, this was a prototype for a whole game, actually.
Okay.
If you're going to really think about it.
That's a good point.
Maybe the reason why I insisted on putting it in the game and didn't want to drop it is because I felt like there was really a lot possible there. And I wanted to like get it going a little bit mentally. Yeah.
Dip a toe in that particular pool.
Because if I threw it away, maybe I would never come back to it.
Right.
You know? So one of the things about the game, we've already said, wanted to feel kind of painterly, kind of analog, expressive. It's not a bunch of tiles. And there are places in the game where you would normally, traditionally, just splat out a bitmap a bunch of times, aside from map tiles. So for example, 2-3 is the monster hunt level, where there's like a HUD on top that says hunt, and there's icons of monsters, and you jump on one and it crosses it out. Most games of that time and earlier there would just be like a monster HUD bitmap and an X bitmap, and you just draw those.
Yes.
And in fact, if you look closely at that level, all of the 6 monster icons are different.
Okay.
And all of the X's are different.
Okay.
Why? Because it feels a little bit better and it's more in the spirit of the game, right?
Okay.
And so that is the kind of thing that I was doing and wanted to do,
see.
right?
Okay.
So on 2, 3, after you go down the pit, you go straight back up the other side.
Yes.
And there's like guys falling down and there's compartments on the side.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember there being a level in like Yoshi's Island or something like that that was exactly that.
Okay.
And this one's more unfair. It's like the guy comes down way faster.
Right.
And you don't get as good of an audio cue and stuff. And
Right.
so it's a little bit like frustrating, right? But it's designed to illustrate this idea. The illustration may be very subtle and not gotten by a lot of people who don't think about game design, right? And so you can attempt it again and attempt it again, which you would do in a normal video game, but with a much longer sort of
right.
experiment loop, because you probably respawn somewhere earlier in the level and at cost to you,
Right.
which is why it's unfair, right?
Right.
Because you lose lives or whatever.
Right.
And here it's like that doesn't happen, right? There are 2 parts to the level. There's an above ground part and a below ground part, and they're pretty much separate.
Okay.
So you go to the below ground part, and there's a key that's pretty easy to get.
Right.
And then there are 2 gates, and you have 1 key and 2 gates, and
Right.
you might think, oh, I need to go look for the other key, but
Right.
there's no other key on the level. And so you hopefully learn that you can open 2 gates with 1 key by, judicious use of your abilities.
Right.
It's not that hard of a puzzle. In fact, you could solve that one accidentally because it's so simple.
Right. And the way that works out is because there are marked, like some of the elements are marked rewind exempt, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then there's a harder puzzle right below that is a similar situation, but with 3 gates.
Okay.
And so there's a bit of a progression there.
I see.
Okay, you get this. Do you get this, which is a more complex version of the same thing.
Right.
But it's certainly not asking you to do the same thing twice.
Right. It's asking you to do a similar thing.
Yes. I mean, the same thing a bunch of times just turns into like Towers of Hanoi or whatever,
Yes,
which is one of the most annoying so-called puzzles in the universe.
Yes.
I mean, it's fine, 2,000 years ago or whenever it was invented for like manipulating blocks because that's kind of fun, but it's not so fine in a modern video game. There are other ways of obfuscating a puzzle, and obfuscating is maybe not the right word. There are other ways of artfully misdirecting the player away from the trick in a way that's fair and that feels good. And this comes down to the fundamental problem, which is something that I learned probably mainly from designing Braid, and that I went on to think about a lot harder in The Witness, right? But it was this idea of, like, where does magic come from when you're solving a puzzle exactly? Like, sometimes you solve a puzzle and you're like, okay, I figured out the thing to do. And other times you're like, whoa, that was super cool.
Mm-hmm.
And in the most extreme of times, which again, I can recommend people Steven's sausage roll for this experience. Sometimes if there are few enough things on the level,
mm-hmm.
you can look at the level and say, I know this is impossible.
Yes.
Like the developer is completely trolling me.
Yes.
There is no way to solve this.
Right.
And then you figure out how to solve it. And that is maybe the most magic because you did the impossible.
Right.
You could explain to somebody why it was impossible. And of course, there was something about that explanation that was not quite right.
Right.
But you could certainly explain to yourself and maybe to other people, like, clearly this level is not solvable.
Yes.
And so there's at least one dimension of magic spectrum there, and there probably are multiple.
Right.
And so part of what I was doing over the course of designing Braid was getting a feel for what is more magic and what is less magic.
I guess the easiest thing to start with today would be something that we mentioned earlier but haven't actually discussed in detail, which is the idea for like the retro games. So
yes.
Early on, I don't know that I ever had a build in which I could play it, but I definitely saw you play the Mountain King retro game. I don't remember myself ever seeing any other retro games, and of course in the final version of Braid, there are no retro games.
None of that's in there. Yeah.
Maybe it would be a good time to just like go over like what was the plan there? Why did you decide you didn't want the plan? And what would it have looked like had it actually been implemented?
Well, so the general layout of the game is highly patterned, right? There are some number of worlds. You collect puzzle pieces in them. It's the same number of puzzle pieces. They have entrances from the house. In the middle of the worlds, there's a puzzle frame where you can stop by and do the pieces. At the end, there's always the stuffed animal dinosaur dude, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it had been the idea, and this probably started as one of those mildly wacky ideas, but then inside each world, you know, somewhere in the middle, kind of like the puzzle frames are now, there would be some door that you could go through that would take you to some other video game.
Okay.
That was essentially a port of the game, like not a super 100% fidelity port. Like it's not trying to look exactly like the original one pixel for pixel, but the point being, it's an adaptation of that game modified by the rules of time in the world that you were in.
Okay.
And why? Well, because I was making this game and I wanted it to be big and cool and have cool ideas in it, and that seemed like one. You know, Braid itself being rooted in a Super Mario Brothers kind of a thing suggests that to begin with, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, possibly some of this thought began way back when I was thinking about should it be a Super Mario Brothers thing or something else, and I'm thinking about what are the different game genres and all this, right? And so I had some ideas. I never got even so far as to know what all the games would have been.
Okay.
Because it's a little bit hard to come up with a retro game and then not only like, okay, it's not that hard to re-implement a retro game. Those games are pretty simple by modern standards, even in 2008. Especially once you already have a game engine running that like does 2D stuff and whatever. It's like, okay, we just transpose the arcade game into this system that I have running. The hard part is, can I pick and curate arcade games where the combination of that old game and the way it worked and the new rules of time make something interesting and gratifying to play? And I wasn't really able to solve that problem, although I didn't spend an intense amount of time working on it, because at some point it became clear, oh, the game's just going to be too big if I do this for everything. But I did prototype it a bit for Mountain King, which, okay, so Mountain King is a game from the 80s that was ported to a number of systems. I probably mainly played it on the C64, but I believe it even existed on the VIC-20 and even on the Atari 2600 maybe. There was like a kind of a bad port of it.
Was this a home computer game primarily, or was it an arcade game that then
I
got
never
ported?
saw it in an arcade.
Because I haven't either.
I believe it was a home computer kind of
so
game.
So it may have been just whole cloth, never in an arcade kind of thing.
Anyway, the way that it works is you start on a mountain where quote unquote mountain is a bunch of sort of parallel platforms that as you're lower down, it's almost a little bit random feeling, like you have a long strip of platform and then a hole and whatever. But as you go toward the top, it sort of narrows out and becomes like mountain peaks. So if you want to go up the mountain, you're jumping from level to level to get to the top.
So if you're on the furthest left of this mountain, jumping up would not go anywhere because there isn't maybe anything
the map
there.
wraps around. But you can go down to the very bottom level where, you know, there's some kind of Indiana Jones situation where there's like a giant spider that patrols back and forth.
Okay.
But so you can open this door and climb up to a throne room where there's a crown.
Okay. This is very complicated.
Now, once you put on the crown, music starts, the Hall of the Mountain King theme. And you have until the song ends to get to the top of the mountain while wearing the crown.
Just like The Witness.
A little bit.
Right, right.
But for some reason, it's one of those games that I really remember a lot. I'm not sure exactly. Like, it was just very different from other games of the time in how it worked, and I didn't try to exactly reproduce the map or anything, but it was the same kind of a thing.
Right.
And, I had fun implementing that. It was, again, like a week or less. Like, that's always a fun thing when in a few days you can sit down and bang something out and it's like there.
Yeah.
But like, people didn't really like it. Like, literally nobody I talked to liked it, which it's normally not a huge influence on how I make decisions, right? For that to be negative and to be worth putting in the game as a negative playtest result, it has to be a really good idea that makes the game stronger.
Right.
And so far, it's just a random idea that I thought would be fun. And so let me think about it more. Do I see how it's a really good idea that's integral to the game that makes the game better? And I never came up with a way that was true. It was just an additional thing that was cool the whole time.
Right.
And then it was like, well, what happens when you win? Because all of them were going to be things with win conditions. Is it like yet another collectible?
Right.
And I may have already had both of the current kinds of collectibles in there. And like a regular collectible plus a secret one is kind of cool. But like a third one, now it's a casual game or something where you have different currencies and whatever, right?
Right, yeah.
And so I didn't exactly want to do that, but I didn't know what would be better. So yeah, I just was like, dump it.
So underlying this discussion, though, is kind of something which I don't think I totally understand to begin with, which is that Mountain King was implemented for World 1, if I remember correctly.
I do not remember which world it was. I was about to say it was World 2 because I feel like it had rewind.
Okay, so because what I was going to say
Or it might have even been World 3.
How was Mountain King modified by the time mechanic then?
I think it wasn't really, and that was part of why things were not totally borne out. Like, my guess is it was World 3 and the crown was sparkling. So if you lost it, you couldn't rewind. And so it did enhance it a little bit in that you knew what these things meant from the main game.
I see.
And it gives it just a little bit of a mental like tinge. And you can rewind up until like getting the crown. And even after getting it, you could rewind, but like you wouldn't have it. But like it wasn't that big of a change either. So it was just like, oh, I've got my own version of Mountain King, and that's fun.
Yeah. So it sort of sounds almost like the problem was that old arcade games, unless maybe you just missed some or something, don't suddenly become interesting in a time sense just by turning these things on. It seems more like maybe games sort of have to just be designed with this in mind to be interesting. So it's not...
I don't know because I was looking for the magic.
Yeah.
I didn't totally find the magic, but I also didn't look that hard.
So maybe it was just a perseverance issue and it was like, the game doesn't need this, so let's just move on.
I'm not going to claim that the thesis is one way or another. I would say that if you wanted to do this, if you picked a random arcade game and a random time modification, yes, probably... The combo is not very good.
Right.
So the question is like, is there a large enough subset of things that you could realistically find one that's good? But that's not that different from what I do when I design games anyway.
Right. Did you have any other arcade games in mind had you chosen to pursue this idea?
Yeah, I didn't implement any other ones, but I was thinking about Burger Time for some reason because it didn't totally make sense, but like Burger Time with World 4 would mean that the burger was like coming back up if you went left.
That does sound awesome.
So I was sort of thinking about that, but it's still not really playable unless you do some other stuff, right?
Yeah. Maybe you could have it be sort of toroidal, so if you walk off the right side, you come back on the left.
I didn't even think of that, but...
It feels like that would sort of make it work.
And it's weird because Mountain King was rapping, I think.
I think that's probably everything there is to say about the retro games because they didn't really...
Yeah, it was never a major part of the game.
Yeah, it seemed like it was dropped pretty early from my recollection.
Yeah, well, it took a while to try it out. So like the idea hung around for a while.
Yeah.
But then it was gone. And it was dropped before we did good art for the game or whatever, right? Which was the second half of development. World 4 is time is tied to space. In fact, I think it was t equals x and then t equals y, which there's no t equals y in the final game.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
But how did you have that idea, or?
It was this physics initial idea. And so once I realized, okay, there's rewind in this game, it's working well. How do I tie in the other physics ideas? Because there's maybe supposed to be quantum mechanics and relativity and whatever. And
right.
Well, what is there about relativity? Like, there's 4 dimensions, right? And like time is a dimension. Can I put that in this game somehow? And does that involve rewind in some way?
I see.
And, regular space-time for us is like 3 + 1 before you start talking about string theory or whatever.
Right.
This game is 2 dimensions. So like, how do I is it 2 + 1? And just somehow it just maps onto the idea of like, what if I just controlled time by your position, right?
Right.
It's just the idea popped up. What can I say? Like those were the inputs. And in this concrete case, it was not very hard to have the idea, let's just map it to space because that'll be cool. It's again, I start thinking about what that is before I implement it. And it's like, oh, it'll be kind of neat that you're kind of in control of the motion of the world. And if you stop, everything stops. Like before I try to make puzzles with that, it's got an interesting feel and an interesting kind of interactivity, right? And then I think, how would I implement it? And it's like, well, it's pretty easy to look at like, where is the player spawn? In the very initial implementation, maybe even in the final thing, your spawn point is just like the leftmost part of the level. Mm-hmm. So there's no question about, could I go earlier in time than when I spawned in?
Right.
So you just literally load the level and then you simulate it forward. And then instead of just the rewind key, you have an alternate input that's if you walk left, rewind the rewind buffer by that amount, right? And that's very easy to think of implementation wise. And you could kind of hack it in and like, well, if there's some robustness issues with this or whatever, we'll think about it later, right?
But it can't quite rewind the rewind buffer, can it? Because isn't the way that works in Braid that you can also rewind?
Yes.
So it can't quite rewind the rewind buffer in the way that the rewind buffer normally gets rewound because it needs to be putting that action also onto the rewind buffer.
So it's a little bit different. It's like,
you might look at the rewind buffer and apply it or something?
Yes, okay. It's seek to the time indicated by the leftward travel.
Right.
Round to the nearest frame.
Yep.
Right. Take that state and then forward diff the current state to that.
Right.
Right. And that's the new rewind frame. Right. So it is not trivial, but if your code is not a flaming nightmare, it doesn't take that long.
Yeah.
Especially if you're not worried. I'm sure the rewind buffer was just a flat array at that time or whatever. Of each frame is a thing, and then there's probably a data structure for each frame. It wasn't that sophisticated, but I don't care, right? There's not that many objects in this game. It's a proof of concept. It's all good.
Right.
Yeah. With regard to how did I come up with the different worlds, I just had ideas. Mm-hmm. And of course I would have an initial guess about whether this was a good idea.
Right.
And some ideas are interesting, but seem like they're going to hit a brick wall really fast. Some ideas sound cool as a high level idea, but I couldn't even find a way to make it actionable, like a mechanic again, right?
Can you give any examples? Do you remember any of these ideas that basically got tabled because they didn't work out?
Well, I could start by talking about ones that I actually implemented.
Okay.
Well, there's 2. So you already mentioned the t equals y, right?
Right.
Which is mildly different from t equals x, right? It's the same implementation detail technically. It's like you just decide the other axis is controlling the thing. And interactively, it's a little bit different because it's cute that, you jump. And so jumping has an up part and a down part. So a jump automatically has a forward in time and a backward in time piece.
Yes.
Right. Now, the thing is, the jumps are pretty short in the game. They're like much shorter than Mario jumps for reasons.
Okay.
That with the other objects in the game, so the primary other object I'm looking at, so that the level that was in the early version of the game was the little monster guys being shot out of cannons, right?
Yes.
And because if they're walking very slowly, in the amount of time that a jump takes, they don't go very far. And so they'll go forward and back, but there's just not much of a state change that happens there, right? On the other hand, if I shot them out of cannons, if the velocity is really fast that they get shot at, then they'll change appreciably over a time frame like that.
Right.
But then it becomes kind of hostile to play. And so this one level that I made was you're climbing up a trellis and there's cannons shooting across it, and you're sort of trying to navigate around, find the path up that will not result in you being beamed, right? Which is in some sense, a static solution for that exists, because at any Y coordinate, there will be monsters at any XY coordinate, right?
Right.
And I didn't have a lot of other ideas for it. Right. And also the general tenor of the rest of the game is the levels are horizontal and they're a little bit vertical enough to make interesting situations. And suddenly when T equals Y, it's like, well, you end up with levels that are probably really tall.
Okay.
Or at least levels where you go up to the top and all the way back down and up to the top and all the way back down.
Right.
And I was just thinking about what are the possibilities there. And I never came up with anything. Like, there's always this thing where you start with an idea and it's not working out that well. But maybe if you get over some hump and find a few things, it'll click better, right? It's like two atoms forming a molecule. It's like maybe they repel each other, but then you get them into the correct energy well and they'll like snap into an equilibrium, right? Sometimes design is like that. And for that thing, I just didn't ever find it. And so then there was still the idea I could keep it in the T equals X world just as an ending thing, like a little punctuation on the end, like a surprise. But the other worlds don't have something like that. And it just wasn't that good in the end, right? So yeah, I didn't. And also, like some of the other monsters, there's almost no interaction with at all. Like in the very beginning of the game, I don't think there were the plant monsters that go up and down. But those were added not too long after, I don't think.
Right.
And unless I made horizontal ones, there's almost no interaction you can have between climbing upward and avoiding those monster guys. I mean, it could be that they would kill or don't kill like other monsters, but that's also kind of statically determined and uninteresting.
Right, yeah.
So, it just wasn't good, you know?
Right.
And I saw that relatively quickly, although that said, it's possible that I missed something, right? And there would have been something cool there. Okay, so another thing that I implemented and was in one of the versions of the game, although probably not in the very first one. You know, again, thinking about the physics basis of the game originally, what are some things about physics at a small scale? Well, things are quantized.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff about that with like the speed of light moving like in increments or something.
Or like black body radiation, for example, being only solvable. Like that's how quantum mechanics was discovered, was like if you try to solve the equations for when things get hot, what wavelengths should they emit and how much? It was like nonsensical and didn't match measurements, right? And then to match measurements, it turns out like, if you can only give off photons at certain discrete energy levels, then this all works out. And that's actually how they started looking at quantum mechanics.
Which is mildly terrifying because you don't normally think of things in the real world as being quantized.
But they are. They totally are, right?
Okay.
So
God ran out of bits, I guess.
And I don't think that's what happened. But anyway, so
there's a mechanic based on this quantization?
What if, since the game is about time now, then the quantization would affect time. And so what I implemented was, again, time the whole game is paused.
Okay.
And then instead of, how you use the arrow keys and you have the jump button, right?
Yes.
Instead of those being continuous inputs, you get this little like control HUD that pops up over your guy that has like the 4 arrows and the jump button.
Oh, I remember this.
And then you hold them down because you might want to go diagonal or something.
Yes.
If you just want to go forward, you tap forward and release it, and your guy goes a certain amount, running the continuous simulation for a fixed amount of time.
I see.
Right? If you wanted to go diagonal and jump, you hit all 3 of those and then release them, and he does that.
I see.
Right?
So you it's like a turn-based Braid.
Turn-based, but with the same simulation underneath because...
Right.
I mean, you could invent in a whole entire turn-based version of the game, and some people might do that, but it didn't seem along the lines of what I wanted to do.
Okay.
Like, this wasn't a game where you go into totally different simulators in every world. It was a game where it's the same one, but it's modified.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I did that, and again, I had trouble coming up with puzzles and controlling situations to make them interesting. And it was just this mode of having a discrete time step that then played out in a simulation. It was pretty sloppy, and it was hard to even think about what was going to happen. Like, what's a typical thing that happens in this game? Well, there's a monster, maybe he's walking away from you toward a wall, and he's going to bounce off, and then you want to jump on him. Right. And in continuous mode, in the beginning, that might be hard to learn, like when to jump and how, if you want to bounce off him. Right. In this mode, it was way even more awkward to learn.
Right.
And the end result just wasn't good. Like, okay, I'm doing this interaction and that's cool, but I'm not getting more out of the interaction than I put in.
What about the things that did work? Like, how did we end up getting to, like, World 5, for example, or the final world or whatever?
Well, again, starting with these principles of it was a physics game, but now it's a rewind game. Okay, what can we do? Like, the physics informs what kind of rewind things we could think about. And so, hey, there's this whole quantum mechanics thing. There's, for example, this whole many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. And so maybe there's a world where you can somehow control what choices get made, and they happen differently in different things. And that's where World 5 came from. And starting with that abstract idea, and then there's the question like, okay, how is that concretely implemented within the framework that we have? And it's like, well, it's a game where you rewind. So instead of rewind just undoing everything that you did, what if all that stuff just happens again? But then you also now can do something new. And once you think of that, it's like, well, do you support that n times, or is 2 enough? And I decided to stay with 2.
Okay.
And also there are other questions. So the temptation, if you want the most easily implementable thing, you would be like, well, we somehow just replay the rewind data that you just rewound, right? We save that somewhere and we push it back on going forward. And then you can just also do something new. But I didn't want to do that because if both realities going forward are totally separate and cannot communicate, that's a little bit dry, and it leaves off the ability to do certain kinds of puzzles. So for example, in World 3, we have objects that are immune to rewind, right? You could have that here too. Are there still like 2 of them in 2 separate universes, or is it 1? Like, what does that mean? That's a question. And then is there a different thing, which is, again, the same way that things were exempt from being rewound before? Is there things are exempt from being in 2 universes, right? Are they in 1 always?
Right.
As soon as I thought of that, it's like, okay, then you definitely can't just replay the same thing forward, because by doing things in 1 universe, you can change the state of the other universe at a given time, because you, like, there's a monster that's in both and you stomped on him in 1, and so he dies in the other one as well.
Right, yeah. So basically what you ended up choosing was the one where, okay, we're going to act as if there is a second player who just happens to try to do exactly the same things you did at the exact times you tried them, but then we're going to recompute the physics of what happens to the guy based on the actual positions of all the things according to the world rules. So if you move a platform that only exists once across both realities, then he will just miss it if now it's not there and fall down or whatever.
Or if something is there that wasn't there before.
Now he can't run through it or something.
Etc.
Lands on one yet.
Yes. And then from there, it's like, okay, well, what do you do if you don't just play back the rewind data? Well, you do input recording. That's the thing that we all knew about because it's a way that you would test your 3D game or whatever back in the day. And like, I know some people were very gung-ho about input recording. I always had problems with it of one kind or another. Like, there's one point in your game loop where you read input. So just when you do that, also record it and then play it back from exactly that point.
Right.
In my experience, it always gets more complicated than that. And I don't know if I've just been unlucky or whatever, but I've talked to people who said, no, I just do this and it's a piece of cake. But it's never been a piece of cake for me, including in Braid.
Fair enough.
But I knew that you can do that, and I knew what it was like, and I knew what the results are.
Right.
And so I said, that's the right thing for this because it means you can change the consequences.
And so by that, you kind of mean, just if I make sure I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
So there are two ways you could implement this feature. One way to implement this feature is that when I see the playback, like in Braid, there's, you know, I do a thing, I rewind, and then I see like ghost version of me do that thing. In one version, that guy lands on the platforms that are there in his world always. So I can't like move a platform in my world and ever have that affect him because he's literally just going to follow the exact path he followed. No matter what, right?
So to be clear, you know, the rewind data that we spoke of before is numbers like at what coordinates is the guy standing, right? What is the, you know, you could have some integer state variables on or whatever. And the naive version of this or the simple version of it would just be playing those numbers back.
Right.
And so you could never change anything. If you went that way, you could imagine something where that universe can affect yours.
But not vice versa.
It can't be affected. And that didn't seem that cool.
Right.
Right.
In a Time magazine article, they quoted you as saying the following: I've been interested for a long time in what kinds of communication are possible. Are there other forms of communication that we can refine in the way that we've refined language? And it's almost an experiment going on that you're doing where you're like, how much can I communicate without directly talking at you? Like what sorts of things can I create in a game before English gets deployed, right?
Yes.
Like, did you want to say anything sort of big picture about that to go with all the things you said, which are kind of all about that in a way?
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely an idea that I got a glimmer of during Braid. The Witness is like a lot about this, right? But going back to Braid, it's like I was learning it and playing with it a little bit. And one of the standout examples for me, and it's probably going to be hard to explain. Like, it's going to seem like a small thing, right?
Well,
but there's a level in World 5, which is the alternate universe one, where you need to get a key across a pit, right? And the original version of this level was different from how it is now. The original version of the level was maybe, like we were saying before, a little too obvious.
Okay.
The way in which it was a little too obvious was, you know, the idea was I wanted a key shared between universes because one of the things that could happen is one instance of you could transfer it to another instance of you, right? So in the original version of this level, you would go over. So if you're going to pass the key from one instance to another of the guy, there sort of has to be a reason why that guy just can't do the thing that you were going to do, right?
Okay.
Let's just say it's a key that opens a gate that's on the left. even if that gate isn't shared in the universes, if he walks over there and opens it, and then you rewind, and that key's not rewind exempt, now he's going to walk over there and open it, and he's not shared between universes, but the key is, so it'll open the gate in your universe, right? So in order to make this idea work, there has to be some constraint that the shadow universe guy just cannot go to the target position for whatever reason.
Okay.
So my original idea was, well, you just sort of fall down a thing that's too high to go back up, and there's like a hole, like the Count of Monte Cristo or something, that you put the key through, right?
The Count of Monte. I don't think I know. I mean, I know vaguely
a famous,
the reference.
But
it's
I'm thinking of this.
Book, but...
Again, it's a little bit of a Calvino reference because he has his own Count of Monte Cristo take.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
All right.
That works because the guy can't go through the hole in the wall. But holes in the wall do not happen that often, right? Like sometimes I had already been putting them as, there are holes that the monster can fit in. They're little monster tunnels where we would put a key or something, right?
Okay.
And I might put a little lip on it just to help emphasize the fact that the player can't go in there, even though without the lip only. Doesn't do anything. Yes.
No Tims allowed.
Yes. So I designed this and it worked mechanically, but it did exactly what I was saying before, which is it's too frickin' obvious.
Right.
Now, one way to make it less frickin' obvious is there's a whole bunch of these weird holes in the walls. Like he's in the mail room of a large corporation now.
Right,
there's just mail slots in all the doors.
Yes,
I don't know, right?
Yes. You could have made it a more standard environmental feature everywhere, but then it begs the question why.
That makes the whole game noisy,
exactly.
Right? That's not very good.
Yeah.
Just for one puzzle, no.
Yeah.
Right? But the other thing you can do is think, how can I achieve this via other elements? And what I came up with was, instead of just a wall there's a pit, and we can even add a little bit of a verticality to the two sides of the pit to make it even more clear that you just can't really jump out from the right going to the left. You're just going to die. Right. It used to be this guy's just sort of standing somewhere and pushing the key through the mail slot, right? Now he has to jump into spikes and kill himself.
Right.
To hand me the key, right?
Yeah.
And that's me, and I just did intentionally do it.
He's sort of a martyr.
And he's going to go away anyway, but it's weird, and it's in this strange space that I was aiming for, but it's very dramatic in a way that a lot of things in the game aren't.
Yeah.
So that was also good. That was a reason why I like that version of the level.
Interesting.
Already there's an interesting question, like a game mechanics question or a programming question, like if both of you are overlapping the key, who actually gets it?
Yeah.
And I prioritized the newest instance, which is always the one that you're live playing, gets it, right? But that doesn't have to be the rule. That's one of those rules that you make up. That's a second order thing that fills in and helps make sense of, or helps instantiate the more general rule about keys could be shared between universes or whatever.
Right. Because somebody has to, when we don't know from some grand scheme what the rule should be, the designer has to make up what the rule is that fills in the gap.
Yeah, and there's a lot of art to making that decision correctly, because you can come up with a very uninteresting game by making that decision wrong.
Right.
Most of the levels, you go into them, and there's a name for the level, and it comes up on the screen. And it kind of tells you what the level's about, but not really in a spoilery way, hopefully. Right. For this level, I was like, what name do I put there? That kind of doesn't spoil this thing.
I see.
Like, if you called it handoff or something, that gets maybe people don't know exactly what that means, but you're going to kind of spoil the idea.
Or sacrifice, similarly.
Sacrifice would be the sacrifice of Isaac. Yeah.
You kind of know that, like, okay, one of my guys probably gets killed in the spikes here.
And you ruined the feeling and the surprise and, like, the gut clench that happens.
Right.
And so I was like, oh, well, this is also a place where I can break the pattern.
Mm-hmm.
So I break the pattern here, and, well, there's two things that happen, right? The level fades in. There's an icon representing the level.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a name.
Mm-hmm.
And for this level, there's an icon, which just illustrates somebody standing next to a pit with a key, and no name.
Mm-hmm.
And that felt to me like a good place to put it. Because the fact that there's no name, before you even go into the level, is communication. Because we broke the sequence.
Mm-hmm.
You notice that, hopefully, unless you're just sleepwalking through the game.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, that's weird.
Mm-hmm.
What?
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, okay, I'm going to tread carefully for a little bit. Like, the human mind just has this in it, right? Like, I'm going to tread carefully for a little bit because I don't know
what's going on here.
I don't know exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
Something changed, right? And so that's what that is. It's a little signal that this is an area of a little bit more tension or a little bit more drama or something, right? But also you get to decide that. Like, I don't play music to make you feel a certain way. I mean, apart from the music that's already in the game, I don't go dun 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 as the thing fades in,
or like
whatever.
tense violins.
No. In fact, it's a small change.
Right.
And it's not linguistic. In fact, we take away the language.
Yeah.
It's more like body language or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? It's the body language of the game is like suddenly the game feels a little bit strange about something and isn't saying hi to you in the morning when it normally would.
Okay.
And it's like, wait,
it's passive aggressive.
Did I not do the dishes last night? Like, what?
Yeah.
Why is this?
Right.
And that's one of the examples that stands out the most in my mind in the game. It's one of my favorite examples. It's subtle enough that, again, I'm not sure a lot of people think much about it consciously, because that fade in only lasts a couple of seconds. And then probably what most people remember is the actual level that comes after. But the thing to realize is how that level is received. The part that people remember, their experience there depends on the initial conditions.
Right.
Right. Even if they forget the initial conditions.
Right. Yeah.
And so initial conditions are important. And then World 6, again, came from these physics ideas. It's like, okay, relativity. You have this time dilation thing. What if I just, not trying to make it be about speed of light or anything directly, but let's just put time dilation in and just see how that goes. And I wasn't sure at first if that was going to generate enough interesting situations.
Right.
And it turns out to have, although it is mostly kind of binary, right? It's like, well, I want something to go slow is the way that it gets used.
Right.
But that's actually mostly fine. And there are nuances to some of the levels that make it more like the analog part of it comes into play a little bit more. And so the initial implementation, so if you're thinking about, okay, what would this actually be?
Yeah.
It's like, well, you're dropping a singularity somewhere where things are totally frozen somehow at that point. And then maybe we add a little bit of a fudge factor so that you don't walk into that point and then the game is over, right? So one of the problems is with the rate itself. Like going way down towards zero, it's not that fun to try and play. Like requiring that is weird.
Because the player just kind of moves too slow through there and it's...
Yeah, everything. Like if anything going through there is so slow that it's not fun to wait for it. Or, and to require that in a solution wouldn't be that fun.
Right.
Also, even before implementing this, I knew like, hey, the music and stuff, sounds go backward when you rewind. They should slow down appropriately when you're in this thing. And I already could picture in my mind what that would feel like. Like you would go into the music and it's like, right? Now, O.2, which is the current factor that I chose, is about the place at which you can still kind of hear the music, but it's pretty slow. Like if you slow things down much further than that, the sonic energy is like so slow that you don't even hear anything coherent. And you also, it would be one thing if you were, I don't know, holding the ring in your hand constantly the way you hold a key and moving around. Because then you could like find the spot that does what you want, but it's not like that. It's like you drop it and it's on, and now you pick it up. And maybe I could have tried more of the other thing, but that seemed bad because you would be walking around in the slow thing 100% of the time. It's like it.
Well, based on all the things you're saying, I kind of have, I think, what I assume the obvious question that anyone would have at this point is, why slowing down? Why not speeding up?
I think I just like the slowing down.
Okay, just aesthetically speaking, you like things going in and going. Whoa.
Yeah, but also there's a reason to bias things in that direction, which is, again, so it's a puzzle game, most of which you have tuned to be playable at 1.0, right?
Right.
If things get slower than 1.0, it's playable.
Right.
Mostly. It's just, slower. Right. If things get a lot faster than 1.0, maybe it's not playable anymore. Like if you're trying to jump on a monster, like if you're jumping on monsters at 0.2, it becomes a really different experience, right?
Yep.
If you're trying to jump on monsters at 5.0, like that's unplayable.
Right.
Now, that said, I never explored. That's the reasoning, or some of the reasoning, right? I never actually went and explored that. And sometimes you do it and you find that there's something you didn't think of. Or whatever.
Right. But this one worked, so it
was
wasn't
fun. I started doing it and I found it was cool and there was enough to do with it, right? What were we talking about? In World 1.
It's smaller.
It's smaller, and that's kind of okay. Well, it's definitely okay, but why? Because it comes at the end.
Mm-hmm.
The shortness of the puzzles leading up to the ending is used to make a sequence that, again, while you're in the middle of the sequence, you kind of know something different is going on.
Right.
Well, especially because you went into the door in the attic and all that. Like, you know something different is going on, and you're just trying to picture the boundaries of, like, what's happening here. Or, you've gone through levels like the other level we mentioned. They don't have titles, and they don't have puzzle pieces. You're just getting to a door, which, interestingly, is what the original World 1 was, too. There weren't puzzle pieces in the game at that time. So that's a case in which being of a different size is fine. Also, the epilogue is also, a few screens.
Right, yeah.
If the epilogue had 12 different things to do, it would be a very different experience, and I'm not sure. Like, design would have to change in some way.
Right.
In Braid, there are definitely some little tool-like things, but they're mostly the minimum that I had to do to ship the game.
Okay.
So, for example, in World 1, aka World 7, there's this idea that physics is running backwards for the monsters that live there.
Right.
From your perspective. How do you make physics run backwards? Well, again, you could just play back a bunch of recorded frames, but then things can't really change unless you were to, like, break things out of that recording and simulate them when you interacted with them. But then, to whatever extent that the backward simulator differed from how the look and feel was of the recording, the game would feel awkward.
Right.
So that is just not really seeming like a good way to go at all.
Right.
So instead I said, well, let me come up with some relatively constrained interactions that I can run backwards. And so I have this little mode that still exists in the game if you're in developer mode. And it's like, you run a level forward, and when a monster gets shot out of a cannon, it makes a marker with a certain string tag, monster shot out of cannon, right?
Okay.
And then when it bounces off the ground, it's like monster bounce. At this is the incident velocity into the ground, right? And whatever. And then you can play those backwards.
I see.
Right? So those markers get saved out with the level, and then the monster, if it's walking backwards and hits a marker that says a monster landed here at this velocity, you launch it up at the opposite vector, right?
Yes.
And that actually never completely worked correctly, but it was close enough that, like, I could fiddle with it and it was fine.
Gotcha.
But that was necessary kind of to ship the game, Because otherwise, like, how do I launch monsters backward into cannons and have them get eaten in a way that looks enough like if you're just doing it by hand, you could do that, but like it's not going to look like the reverse of what happens. And that's important because when you rewind, it'll be going forward and it should look exactly like the regular game. So, you know, sometimes you need tools to get things done. Now, there's the epilogue, which we mentioned, which is a little bit going the other direction in that it's very obvious. You don't miss it if you get to the end of the game because you have to walk through it to get somewhere.
Right.
And there I said, what if I have some puzzles and the puzzles are less clearly demarcated as puzzles?
Okay.
Right? Prior to this in the game, puzzles are a puzzle piece or a star. So I wanted puzzles that are less clearly demarcated as a puzzle and that give you a less clear reward. They do give you something for solving them, but it's not a collectible. It's not a really discretely countable thing that exists in the game. Do you know what I mean? Okay. So then that in my mind bridges further out to things that were already there from the beginning. I got the idea to put the epilogue in later, but the fiction parts of the game that are displayed before you go into the game, the mission statement was for them to directly relate to the behavior of the world in some way that you could then notice in that way that like, hey, I read things and I notice things. That's a very intrinsic reward kind of thing because there's no mechanism for the game to even acknowledge, much less give you something.
Right, because it would not know if you had solved it. It can't detect that you solved it.
Yeah, and if it's too on the nose exactly even what there is to solve, then maybe that's a little bit too simplistic, right? And so there's also a dimension of you deciding exactly what were the good, valuable things to notice, right? So that's like extremely intrinsic and unguided. And so the epilogue is maybe an intermediate area between those things.
I'm having a little bit of a hard time understanding why you described the star puzzles as hard rather than obscure, because to me, like, I don't know that I would necessarily say they were hard in the way that a difficult programming problem is hard.
Well,
like,
okay.
When you don't even know that something is there, I wouldn't necessarily say that was hard.
But they're both, okay? So on the one hand, they are obscure. You don't even know where they are. You don't know they exist until you find one.
Yeah.
Some of them are not strictly harder than some puzzles in the game, but other ones very much are. Other ones are very much about going into this territory that I spoke about avoiding before, of having puzzles be relatively longer sequences of things that you have to do. Some of these are like that. So for example, on the level called elevator action. On the level called elevator action, the entryway that you get to know about the star is a little messy. It's messy enough that I wouldn't have put that in the main game, in that like there's just a little bit of dexterity and like doing some rewind stuff that has a narrow time window to achieve and has to be executed a little bit precisely. And then that gives you the opportunity to try to get the star. And then the thing that you have to do to get the star is like a little bit grindy in the sense that you probably die a lot and mess up a lot. And even figuring out exactly what to do is less crisp than elsewhere in the game and all these things, right? Another one that I'm thinking of on this level called Fickle Companion, this is World 4. It's just very explicitly a longer sequence of things that you have to do to get to where the star is. And that was intentional. It was like, okay, because these are secret and because these are things that dogged players are going to find, they can be a little more messy. They can be a little bit harder. I can play around with that. And it'll also be what makes them feel different from the rest of the game, right? If you have secret puzzles, but they're like the same as the non-secret puzzles, it's a little bit interesting because they were secret. You had to find them, but it's the same kind of thing. Whereas if they're a little bit different, if they're doing things that are a little bit absurd. So one of the most famous star puzzle. Whereas if they're a little bit different, if they're doing things that are a little bit absurd. So one of the most famous star puzzle, right, that people love to complain about.
I'm sure I know what this one is.
It's the one where you have to ride on a cloud for an hour and a half. Actually, no, that's not correct. You have to wait for a cloud for 45 minutes to get to where you can jump on it. And then you have to ride it for another 45 minutes or so to get to the star. That's not that hard, but it's like pushing at the boundaries of the space in a way that is not totally acceptable in polite company.
Yes.
But like when you're hanging out with your buds, you can do more of that stuff, right?
Sure. But that doesn't really answer my question. So just to be more specific, like I said, I was trying to differentiate between hard and obscure. And the reason I'm asking that is because when I asked why these were put in the game, you said you were interested in having a layer of the game that was harder. While I can make up answers
I understand the question.
I can imagine answers to this question, but I want to hear your actual answer, which is, it seems like you also wanted obscurity to be part of it, not just difficulty, because those are different things.
Well, here's what I will say. Like, more challenging and difficult to achieve the full secret thing, like getting all of them, was part of the picture from the beginning, right? Which may or may not mean that any specific puzzle is way hard or not, right? So the cloud one isn't that hard, although you do have to figure something out that's kind of subtle with it. That also, by the way, is pretty tweaky in a way that I wouldn't do. Like, even getting on the cloud is a thing that how it works, I just wouldn't consider acceptable for a regular puzzle in the game.
Right.
And so part of what I'm really doing, it's hard. So I'm taking you on a tour of stuff. If you go into this part of the game, you kind of signed up for it, right? You signed up for something a little bit outside the normal part of the game. And this is where, so sometimes people give hate for this part of the game on the internet or whatever, but it's almost never people who actually found it, right? It's oh, I went on the YouTube video that tells me how to get the stars and it's a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
And so your game sucks or whatever, right?
Right.
It doesn't work, right? Yeah. Whereas if you find this piece of magic and then you're like, oh my God, where are the other things and how do I do this? You are opting in to this experience that is at the borders of the game, literally and figuratively. Okay, so you're going beyond the regular game a little bit.
Yeah.
So you're signing up for the special forces in some sense.
Yeah.
Right? And so we can do things because you signed up for that we can't do for most people, right? And maybe you're interested in things because you're a little more of a gamer that most people are not interested in. So one dimension of that is harder. But another dimension of that is maybe it's a little more difficult to see the point, which is a different kind of difficulty. It's interpretive difficulty rather than execution difficulty, right? And maybe another one is just, with the long cloud thing, it's like being a little bit more absurd in a way that, like, if that were the first puzzle in the game that everybody had to play, nobody would get to the second puzzle in the game, right?
Right.
But at the end, for people who signed up for it, it's better. And it also just has natural properties that are good. Like the fact that there's a cloud sitting there is a big mystery. And the fact that there's a callback to it, only understood by some small percentage of people who get through it, is pretty cool. It's pretty interesting. So there's some picture like that, right? So when I said harder, it's sort of two different things. It's that the experience itself is more difficult. And I don't expect most people to finish, even if they start. But it is also that it's okay for individual puzzles to be harder. Those are correlated, but they're different things. But it also doesn't mean it's necessary for them to be harder.
So if I may mine the answer to my question out of that answer,
I don't know what else to say about this,
which is still an
man.
answer to a different question.
I
think you
it.
did answer the question inside there.
Okay.
But I just want to make sure that I'm right.
Okay.
About the answer. You said you discover this thing and it's kind of a little magic. It's like, oh, there's this other thing I didn't know about that was in the game. I take it that's really the answer to my question about why obscurity. The answer is because you could have had a door that's like hardcore Space Marines go through the hardcore Space Marine door and nobody else go through there, right?
Yes.
And that would be another way to have it, right?
If you do that,
yeah,
it seems more like part of the main game, right? It's like, well, this is advanced. It says it's advanced, but it's here. So if I'm really good,
right,
I should go through the door.
Right.
And it's more part of the normal play experience. So hiding it makes it more exceptional and more extra and more like you don't really have to do this to have a complete experience with the game as a civilian.
Okay. So it's less about, well, it might be partially about making it feel magical to find, but also maybe it's a little bit The Last Starfighter. You've created these secret stars to find the players who would want to engage with the stars, if you will.
That is not a bad way to think of it.
Okay.
Or similarly, but differently, like, what's the closest thing to an actual good secret society that you could have?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not like you put a big billboard in the center of town, like, come do our wacky rituals in the room or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But something like this is like, oh, everybody who knows, I mean, ignoring for a fact that we're unfortunately in this world with YouTube and all that, where you can go and spoil it for yourself.
Now everyone knows, but...
Well, surprisingly, though, not really, because, you know, there's a lot of things on YouTube, right? But yes.
For the first 48 hours, those people...
Or, I mean, even now, if somebody picks up the game and plays it, they're unlikely to know about this unless they listened explicitly to something that spoiled them on it.
Right.
So it's still intact, I think, the possibility. And even back then, you know, the internet was not exactly what it is today, but the internet was wide. The game was distributed internet only. So this was known to be a property of the internet at release. And it was just like, okay, I'm still going to do the best that I can do within that constraint. The end result just wasn't good. Like, okay, I'm doing this interaction and that's cool, but I'm not getting more out of the interaction than I put in. That's part of the magic of design, right? Is you find the thing where you do a certain amount of contrivance or a certain amount of setup for the situation, and then you get out of it all these cool things as fuel, as like payload for your game, right? It's like splitting a molecule or something, and the energy comes out. I was just going to say
that. So that's a really interesting way to put it, and I don't think I've ever thought about it that way. So basically what you're saying is you have to think about the design process almost like you were thinking about a power plant. If it's costing you more to get design things out as what you're actually implementing to put in, you're probably doing something wrong, and you should try to look at a different thing or move to a different space, because all you're going to end up doing is making a very Procrustean thing with not a lot of richness. Is that a kind of fair summary?
Absolutely. And I've played lots and lots of games by people who didn't get that. Because if you follow, you know, there have been presentations at conferences about how do you design games? How do you design puzzle games? And it's like, come up with different mechanics that do things. And it's like, okay, but all these ideas that you put into your game and implement have cost, right? Firstly, your implementation cost, your maintenance cost of making sure that when they interact, forget even the interactions being interesting, but like your game has to survive the interaction of things, right? It has to do something that makes sense and is playable.
You have to have a plan for, can the art represent it and all these other
represent it at all, and then in a way that feels like the player can get what's going on,
Yep.
right? Like there's a rule that I have that I think some people understand, which is, if you have a lot of invisible game state, especially in a single player game, it's very hard to play and it's very inscrutable.
Yeah.
And so the role of like graphics and sound effects and vibration and whatever else is in part to help communicate that hidden state so that you can learn it better and understand better what's going on.
Yeah.
So if you make a bunch of rules with a bunch of weird hidden state, you're making that job very difficult to do and maybe impossible.
You see that, I think, a lot in like RPGs, especially like tabletop inspired RPGs, where like they've implemented this big rule set that like a dungeon master would have been reading from.
Yeah.
But it's almost impossible to surface that to a player who isn't familiar with that tabletop game. I've definitely had that experience myself. Like, I don't know how it's determining how much damage this spell is. I have no idea, right?
Yeah.
There's numbers everywhere and all this stuff, and it's just like, I believe you that you've got something in there that's doing it. It also kind of reminds me of something from UI design I've noticed separately, which is like, the harder it is to program a UI's logic control flow in your code, usually the less good the UI is.
Yeah.
Because there's just too much stuff that might be happening for the user to really understand, and
Oh, we have a lot of bad UI these days.
Okay, well, that all makes very good
The
sense.
other thing to say about that, right? It's not just these other internal things that I said, but like the other costs are, what does the player have to learn to play your game? And then what do they have to think about to solve puzzles?
Yeah.
And what do you have to think about to design puzzles? And these are very insidious costs.
Okay.
Because you can be paying them and not realize it. And,
Right.
And that is a thing to avoid. So I've played a bunch of puzzle games where there's just a lot of setup of different objects that they, quote, teach you about.
Right.
And then it's like, here's a level with these things. And what do you do in the level? It's like you just kind of untangle what they set up in the level. And there's no deeper, more enlightening principle to it. There's no surprise. There's no revelation. There's no you getting better at anything aside from untangling messy situations in your head, which after you've done that a couple times, it's just the same thing over and over again. Right. And so that is a failure mode that a lot of puzzle games fall into. And the designers of those games do not even see after they've done it that they fell into that. They're just, it's a puzzle game. Look, I made the puzzle game. If you understand, I did the thing where you put the mechanics, you have the things with different mechanics that are combined to solve the puzzle, and here they are in some rooms. And obviously players can sit down and solve this puzzle, so I made a good puzzle game. And it's like, well, no, the good part is very presumptuous. Right?
Yes.
Good is difficult, and it is something that we have not done a very good job talking about.
I
really
would agree,
ever.
Because I often look for resources that are good for this sort of thing and don't find them.
Yeah. Puzzles where you just grind away and then you come to some solution and the solution does not feel special in any way.
Yeah.
And you don't know anything new.
Yeah.
Those are relatively thankless puzzles that feel like work. And after you do a bunch of those, you'll like nope out of a game or whatever, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you solve a puzzle and you're like, oh my God, I get it. That is by definition a more enjoyable experience, like a more punchy experience, and it will lead you to liking a game more, right? Now, Valve, the problem is they're very focused on, they think of their game as a product, right? And they're iterating on product design. And so from that standpoint, this whole aha moment thing makes sense because it's the way to get your customer to like your game.
Yes.
Right? And that is all true. But I think my standpoint has always been it's missing some things. Both in terms of why does your life have meaning if you're a designer of this stuff?
Yeah.
And also okay, so coming up with aha moments, like what is actionable about this, right?
Yeah.
How do I make these things, and how do I make them good versus not good?
Yeah.
Because this whole idea of the aha moment, again, it's true, but it's incomplete. And so what I tell people to think about is, okay, what is that aha moment for, first of all?
Okay.
Is it just to get people to play your game? Is it just the equivalent of, like, in an RPG, we give people a little bit more loot on a certain schedule so that they feel compelled to keep bashing the monsters, right? Or is there more to it? Can you, if you think you're an artist, then you should have some opinion about the content of those moments, right? Like, imagine somebody, making a film. When, at some point you have characters get emotional and they reveal things about their personality or whatever, right? You can take that in a very cynical way that's like, okay, so to make my film interesting, I'm going to do these paced at certain points throughout the running time. And as long as I put them with enough density, then people will sit all the way through the movie, right?
Yes.
And that's kind of what Valve was saying to some extent, right?
Right.
But, okay, so firstly, if I'm an artist, I care about what exactly these characters are and what they're saying to each other and how their personalities interact. And that's what I really should be thinking about. And if I really am thinking about that, then maybe it's not a problem to come up with dialogue that creates these interesting moments because I'm working with the interesting subject matter at a more core level, right? And so then I don't need this tip about making sure interesting things are said. And maybe if I follow the tip about making sure interesting things are said, I'm actually going to make kind of bad scripts, right? Well, whereas if I'm working with the interesting character material, maybe I just naturally get better scripts, right? This is kind of a bad analogy, but
it's not a bad analogy. Because I could probably clean it up a little bit.
Okay.
So in screenwriting, we do have this exact thing, right? I mean, I don't write screenplays, but I mean, they have it. So in screenwriting, you do have this. And I think the problem is people mistake observations about what tends to be true of well-written scripts for prescriptions on how to write good scripts.
Yes.
And I think the same could be said for game design.
You've got a game, and let's say there's some set of things in the game. Now,
well, Braid, there's keys, gates, monsters, right?
Yes. And we'll talk for a minute about just like noun kind of things. But if you really want to be comprehensive, like there might be like verbs that you can do, like jumping is a verb, not really a noun, right?
Right.
But along one axis, and whether the verbs should be listed in what we're about to say or not, it's sort of two different ways of doing it.
Okay.
The easiest way to think about it is just all nouns, right? So like you might have player is a noun, right? And monster is a noun, like Goomba style monster. I don't want to use that word because it's copyright Nintendo.
Okay.
So I'm going to say monster.
Okay.
It's copyright Italy.
Goomba R.
Yes.
With a circle.
So this idea of good design, quote unquote, with very sarcastic quotes.
Okay.
Not just regular sarcasm quotes.
Okay.
Is that you just want to make sure that any two things interact with each other. And so does player interact with monster? Why, yes, both by jump, right? I could kill the monster, or a monster overlaps with me.
And kills you.
And kills me, right? And so if you make a list of, people have probably seen this kind of matrix where you have, 17 nouns.
Yeah.
You list them both across and down so that everything is cross-referenced to itself along the diagonal.
Like think of a spreadsheet if you don't know what a matrix is.
Yes.
A spreadsheet where you have the rows and columns. You put all the nouns down the rows and all the nouns across the columns. So now you have a big square.
In the same order.
You have a big square to fill in.
And the diagonal is just does this thing interact with itself, which you probably ignore, although maybe not.
Right.
But so then and in fact, everything's redundant because like the upper triangle and the lower triangle are just the transpose of each other. So.
Well, I suppose it depends how you look at it. If it's a transitive action where it's like player acts on Goomba is this, Goomba acts on player
and in
is
fact,
that,
and
that
case,
is in this case.
In this case, yes. So it's player acts on Goomba would be via jump.
So it may or may not be symmetric.
And you could put a check there, and then Goomba acts on player, kills the player, you could put a check there.
Exactly.
And the idea is you just want check marks in all the boxes.
Right.
And then you have a design space that is not like dead. And that's true. Like, and in fact, earlier games had a lot of dead design space. So it is the kind of thing that you solve. The problem is, though, it's like you're bringing this conceptual machinery to bear to solve what is kind of an easy problem that anyone who becomes a good designer already intuited.
I see.
You know, like if you have things in a game that don't affect each other, you end up in situations where it feels kind of bad or whatever. And the rule that you can learn that's much simpler than draw this matrix and put all the things in it is just your game is often richer if things affect each other.
And, you know, it seems to me also that it's maybe phrased a little bit poorly or framed a little bit poorly when presented in the matrix format, because it seems to me it's more interesting to just go, look, this is just a good spot check for you to find possibilities. Like if you're sitting around thinking about something and it's like you kind of a little stuck, think about, are there any things that you haven't looked at for interactions, and look at possibilities there, because the thing that doesn't really make sense to me about the matrix formulation is games usually don't quite break down that way. Like in Braid, it would suck if monsters and keys didn't interact. That is a worse game if you took that away.
Yeah.
I don't think I know if anything important happens between the like Goomba going like to a cannon or something like this. Like there's things where I'm just like, I don't know if that matters, and it's like I wouldn't necessarily think it was bad or good if it did. It's just a possibility.
There are lots of things that don't interact. So for example, bullet shot out of cannon does not interact with key in any way. It does not interact with gate in any way.
Okay.
It does not interact with cloud in any way.
Right.
It doesn't interact with fire pit full of spikes.
Yeah.
It doesn't interact with stuffed animal dinosaur at the end of the level.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it doesn't interact with book podium.
Right.
Like, and so as we said earlier, this is deliberate for Braid because actually for the design to be good with regard to the perturbations of the rule set that happen with time, I wanted a stable, simple rule set that was easy to understand. And actually, if I had done this square matrix thing before adding the time rules, I probably would have ended up with a more complicated rule set.
Yes.
And more importantly, one of the things that you get out of that kind of very dense full interaction matrix is like more surprise. Like the player didn't necessarily think that these two objects would interact, and maybe it's not even likely.
Yes.
But then once in a while they do interact.
Right.
And something cool happens and you're like, oh, I should have expected that. And it seems plausible and natural and whatever. And that's enjoyable. I didn't want that.
Right.
I want that to come from the time stuff.
Right.
Not from like the baseline stuff.
Yeah.
And so if you go do that with the baseline stuff, you're like doing too good of a job with the baseline stuff. And you're crowding out. It's like, if you're mixing a song and like you want the guitar solo to be the point, but you're turning the drums way up and like whatever all the
cowbell,
other things, right? Yes. So that is sort of a meta point, which is that this particular full interactivity space idea is an idea of how to make a game good, and it is contextual whether you want to do that or not. If you have very sophisticated ideas about what you're doing and you know what you're doing, then you may well do the opposite, in fact. Now, of course, the general heuristic applies that you should know the rules to break the rules, right?
Well, and it's a tool, right? It's like it's something you can use to see what areas you haven't explored, which is useful as long as you don't feel compelled, right, to fill it all in because you thought that was the point or something.
Absolutely, right? Hey, I'm kind of stuck. This design isn't working for me.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes our mind just isn't that good at. Sometimes it's very good at like honing in on like exactly what's wrong, but sometimes that's hard.
Yes.
And then you can use a tool like that to just put your attention on every, because this space is very intangible. The space of like what interacts with what.
Yeah.
It's not visible anywhere. And so you could look at this matrix and be like, okay, do I want the bullet shot out of the cannon to interact with the ring, the time control ring?
Yes.
Do I want it to hit the time control ring and bump it sideways or something? In some games, you might. In this game, I did not.
Right.
Because I didn't want the result of any puzzle to be have the bullet bump the time control ring.
Right.
That would have made a worse game.
Right.
But in a lot of games, it makes a better game.
Right.
So, for example, Spelunky, I think, is one of the most successful examples of a game that leverages this kind of multiple object interaction in a way that has a long lifetime through the game that keeps giving you surprises, and that's delightful and funny, even though it usually results in you losing the game.
Right.
It like feels fair and it feels funny. This is actually in Spelunky 2, I felt it was mistuned to where the game was just really sadistic and I didn't want to play it.
Okay. So something about the first one kind of hit a better...
It worked better for me personally. But yeah, so that kind of thing, again, interesting conceptual tool. Like you should understand the idea of lining everything up in a matrix.
Yeah.
Because that's a certain kind of illustration of what it means for things to interact. And if you understand that, then you can use it, as you're saying, as a kind of analytical tool occasionally, right? But the failure mode is to think that the goal is to fill out the matrix with check marks, and not only that that's necessary, but that it's sufficient.
Yes.
And almost everybody thinks that is sufficient.
Right.
And that's why we get so many bad puzzle games.
And I would also add a separate thing, which is that it seems to me to be both a bad idea to fill the whole thing out, and also insufficient to fill the whole thing out, because when I think about games and try to map it onto that ontology, I don't know why you would a priori say that it's a 2D matrix. What if I want 3 things to interact in some cases, or 4? Or what if I want these 2 things to interact, but I want there to be 5 different ways they interact, whereas this thing over here, there's only 1. And so again, even if you took it as a prescriptive thing, I'm going to go fill out the whole matrix, as a naive game designer, I walk into that and go, I still don't really know exactly what that means, because there's so many other things I've obviously seen in games that don't actually fit that model, even if we talk about filling it all the way in.
But that's what I meant earlier, or it's an example of what I meant by seeing this kind of device and like reading it in, looking at how it fits in this framework with the other things that you know. Right? And then does it make a consistent picture, or to what degree does it make a consistent picture? How seriously should I take it? And a lot of people just don't really run that process.
Right. You said that in this game, the jumps are much shorter than Mario jumps.
Yes.
And that is not an accident, apparently. So why is this the case?
Lots of reasons. So it's over-determined, as we say, which means that even if you got rid of some of these, it would still be correct for the rest of them.
Okay. So you really, really in Braid, for many reasons, want these jumps to be
I will
short.
Start listing reasons.
Okay. As part of the framing, could you also say, how did this come about? Like, did you just throw in a value at first and then it got refined over time? Or like is there any also like procedural aspect you just not really remember?
Well, so to lay down the ideas, there's this initial fundamental question. Which is, how does jumping even work mechanically? Do you press the button and just a jump goes?
Right.
Or do you hold the button and you like jump higher?
Right.
as long as you hold it, which is how Super Mario Brothers works, and was considered to be an innovation at that time that made it a lot more friendly and playable. Like if you go back and play like Lode Runner or whatever, I think Lode Runner had jumping, but whatever, you know, all these old platformer games that had jumping.
Even Donkey Kong, I think it just goes a prescribed height.
Yes.
There's no, is there air control in Donkey Kong? There might not
a
be
little
control,
bit, maybe, but
it might just be either you jump up or you jump sideways. I'm not sure, but it only always went the same height.
But jumping was very limited for a long time, and so the Super Mario Brothers jump is both much more controllable, both in terms of like holding the button to control height and air control.
Yes.
Right. And it's also just really big. Like it goes up a large portion of the screen.
Yes.
Which is good if you want to give players a lot of freedom about where to go or what to try. All these are good things. And the more control you give them over the jump, the more they have like recovery from slightly not doing the right thing, which means your levels can actually be harder and people can deal with them. Like you can throw more at them and people can deal with them. So these are all good design decisions in the context of that game. Now, again, the problem is people look at that and say, oh, therefore, these are good design decisions, period.
Right.
And that is not how it works.
Right.
So, okay, Braid, different game.
Right.
Firstly, I wanted the base rule set to be simple.
Right.
I didn't want you to be solving a lot of puzzles with the base rule set.
Right.
Because then we're taking up space that would be used by the time stuff or just muddying it. Like if, okay, there are a lot of things in Braid which are of the form, here's a gap that's too wide to jump.
Right.
Clearly you need to get across it.
Right.
How do you do that?
Right.
And that's already kind of an ambiguous situation. Like if you throw that at a player, they're going to try to jump across the gap a little bit, even if it's way too far, right? So that's problem number one.
Especially if they have rewind, right?
Now, if you give them a tool whereby by holding the button more or less, they can jump further or less far, that makes all of those situations both harder for you to design because you have to make it so that the really far jump not only can't cross the gap, but obviously can't cross the gap because it has to be clear to people that they shouldn't be trying to do that. Right. And you're muddying the situation for the player because any situation they're in, they're like, what are the tools that I have to solve this puzzle with? And one of the tools is always going to be the jump button. And that's true in Braid too, but the jump button in Braid does one very simple, well-defined thing. And the less simple and the less well-defined it is, just the less clear in any context that it is to the player whether it's part of the right answer. That's like how you figure out puzzles is you maybe put forth propositions in some way, like maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And some of those you can discount right away. Like, oh yeah, clearly no, because I can't jump that far. And, and the less clear you make that, the harder you make the general puzzle solving process across the entire game, right? So for example, also there's a little bit of momentum on the Braid character movement. There's some speed up and there's a much faster like slow down to stop because you don't want to feel like you're skidding on ice all the time, right? Having no momentum feels really bad. It feels like a crappy indie game, right? Having a lot of momentum, it starts to be a factor in puzzle solving. Like if I already start running before I throw the switch, I can get to the target place sooner than if I throw the switch and then start running. And that's the kind of thing, I don't want that in the solution space of this game ever. I don't want a puzzle where you solve it by already being running when you throw the switch, because that's not about time. That's about like your running mechanics, right? And so all of the design of the player mechanics was about this, right? It was about pre-curating it. Before I even know what all the puzzles are going to be exactly, it's about pre-curating it to be simple and not to cause problems. Okay, that's number one.
And so basically all of that stuff you just said, it's very clear. It's like, okay, in Braid, the goal is not really to replicate any of the gameplay from Super Mario Brothers. Super Mario Brothers is about doing these action puzzle sequences where giving players really interesting controls is part of creating the richness of that space.
Yes.
In Braid, the idea is you're supposed to be logically kind of like figuring out what is the correct sequence of events here, not sitting around spending a lot of time figuring out just how to do the air control to like go up through the thing or something like that. So these design decisions are basically have to be different in Braid because the type of thing the player is supposed to be doing is just drastically different.
Yeah, and like the conceptual focus of the game is in a totally different place, right? Yeah. And you need, as a designer, to be maintaining that at all times.
Okay.
Decided early on, Braid's a puzzle game. It's not an action game, as you just said. What are puzzles like in this universe? Well, they're pretty much, it's hard to get somewhere. And so the goal is get to that place. And the way we indicate that place is by putting a collectible there or a key or something.
Right.
And that's how you know that you successfully got to the place. All right. Now, I think I already, to some degree, although this became further refined as I kept working on the game, but to some degree I knew I wanted puzzles that are relatively simple in the sense that they're not like all a set of 17 steps, and that's what makes them hard, is to figure out the order and the timing for the 17 steps. Because again, that's probably not about cool time manipulation stuff exactly.
Okay.
Like any game can make you do 17 things in order to solve a puzzle. And once you've solved a couple of those, if it's only about figuring out the order and number of things to do, that just gets boring. Those situations are isomorphic to each other very quickly, right? So I had some sense that it's like, I want to focus on the time stuff. And so I don't want the puzzles to be massively complicated. I want them to be as simple as I can make them while highlighting the cool thing. And again, that became more refined during development, but I believe I had that idea in the beginning. And so once you have that idea, you're like, okay, well, also, what is it about puzzles? Often they're hard, right? What makes a puzzle hard? There's kind of two classes of things. There are things that are on focus to what you're trying to achieve, and there are things that are off focus, right? Things that are on focus that make a puzzle hard is like, well, I'm not used to thinking about time behaving in this way, and there are some consequences of it that I haven't visualized yet.
Right.
So I'm having a hard time solving the puzzle because I don't realize that there's some effect that I can bring to bear.
Right.
And as a designer, you have control over like how much you hint that or whatever.
Right, right.
But when people realize that it's on topic, it's like, oh, that's what the game's about. Now I understand more about the time thing, right?
Right.
Something that's off topic is, well, this puzzle's hard because I'm trying to think about it. And again, there's a lot of steps, and keeping that in my mind like a chess master is very hard for me because I'm not a chess master.
Right, right.
Another one that I was thinking about very heavily early is I can't see the whole puzzle. Right? There's like some stuff off the screen to the left and to the right and up.
Right.
And I'm kind of trying to remember all these elements.
Right.
That makes a puzzle much harder than I can just look at the screen and see all the things.
Right.
And so early on, I had this idea that I wanted a puzzle to fit on a screen because that removes a lot of this incidental difficulty, right?
Right, right, right.
So that leads to compact designs that are simpler in terms of number of walls and number of rooms and whatever.
Right.
We've now stated two constraints. We've said puzzles are about it being difficult to get to a particular place, which often, you know, reading between the lines, this is a game with gravity and you jump and platforms.
Right,
and so
right.
Usually up is hard.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Or across to some place that is separated by something you would fall down through.
Right.
Okay. And we want puzzles to fit on one screen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the height that you jump determines how interesting the puzzles can be.
Right.
And it needs to be short enough that you can fit a puzzle of the interest level that you want, of the maximum interest level that you want, on one screen.
Okay.
Right? If that's not true, if you jump half the screen, then a puzzle could only ever be like 2 jumps max.
Yeah, you could almost see this in something like going from Donkey Kong. I never thought of it this way, but in going from Donkey Kong to Super Mario Brothers, if you had the Super Mario Brothers jump in Donkey Kong, the entire game would take 2 jumps. You just jump to the mid-level, then you jump right to the top, right? So you can immediately see, like, yeah, the complexity that you want on one screen tells you exactly how high the jump can be, because if it's higher than that, you can't make the game.
Yeah.
Like, literally.
Yeah.
Right?
Now, okay, so everything that I just said here is very particular to Braid specifically.
Right.
But the meta skill that I would encourage people to develop is a priori, while figuring out what your game is, to be able to see enough of this kind of constraint for your domain that you're working in, that you then can do something much closer to the right thing out of the gate than you would otherwise, right? Yeah. There is this old idea in games, and it seemed true at the time when people were saying this. The idea was, oh, you know, you can design a game, but the first time a player actually meets your game, they're just gonna, the play test result is gonna be totally different than anything you ever expected. And that's why you have to play test and iterate. And you can't really a priori design. And like, that's a little bit true, but it's actually not that true. Like, if you're a good designer, you actually should kind of know what's gonna happen. Not only is this a puzzle game, not an action game, but what does that mean? Let's come up with a strong statement about what that means, because the stronger and clearer the statement, the more it can guide design decisions. Whereas the statement, this is a puzzle game, not an action game, is not necessarily, again, actionable in the sense that there still needs to be some more steps between that and telling you the answer to decisions. Right. So here's a stronger version of that statement, which I very explicitly formulated to myself. Because it is a puzzle game, not an action game. Once you figure out the answer to a puzzle, you should then just be able to solve the puzzle. There should not be an action element that is hard that you also need to be able to do to solve the puzzle. I see. And then, so that's a statement about solutions. And then you can walk that one step to, what do you do as a player who doesn't know the solution? You attempt solutions. Yeah. If you have a concrete idea about what solution you are attempting, it should not be dexterity based to the greatest extent possible. It should simply be that you try the thing. Now, I think in the game as it stands today, this was not completely successful just because you watch people who are new at the game, they're trying to jump on a monster's head, they miss or whatever, like all these things happen.
Well, we also know for a fact, because it has now been documented indelibly,
that Brian Moriarty
could not finish Braid, despite being one of the people who has played more hours of The Witness than anyone on planet Earth, because he could not successfully jump on one of the bounce, not Goombas, because that's trademarked, monsters.
Now, he may just be much less of an action gamer than most people as well.
Maybe.
Also, though, standards are really different today than even they were back then. Like, in the 2000s, there were hard platformers. And if you go back to the 80s or the 90s, platformers were really hard and tweaky, because that was just the only way to get gameplay out of them, really.
Like, also, there's probably an expectation in 2008, because there hasn't been the iPhone gaming scene and all these other things, that anyone who would find a sure-to-be esoteric game like Braid, which is probably what you're thinking when it comes out, will be a relatively accomplished gamer. That turned out not to be the case, but at the time, no one would have thought, like, oh, all of these potentially casual gamers might check this out, or that isn't what anyone would have been thinking. Probably,
and you know, so what I would just say is this decision was successful, and I did this statement about there shouldn't be an action barrier to solving things was very clearly successfully executed relative to the platformers of 2000 to 2005, which were like very hard, made for gamers and whatever, right? There are also other design parameters to this, right? So for example, how could you make it easier to jump on monsters? Well, maybe if I slow them down so that it's more like they're in one spot and they move slowly,
right.
It's easier to target because you're sort of more targeting a space on the ground than where they are. The problem is that has a pacing effect across the entire game.
Yes.
Now, anytime anybody's solving a puzzle, it takes a lot longer and is slower and all this stuff, right?
Yes.
And then, like, okay, I have a certain amount of space for rewind buffers. If that's like 20 minutes on the most complicated level, if it takes 3 times as long for the monster to go, that's effectively 6 minutes, right? It starts getting scary. Like these kind of things happen. So I think I did a good job given the context I was working in.
Yeah.
But I don't think you can objectively say that there's no action skill required to solve puzzles because there definitely is.
Yes.
It's just not that much compared to what it would have been in another game or what it would have been if I had decided that this was an action game.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
There's an idea that I tend to have about games, which is the following. You can just do some stuff and it's just kind of random and not coherent, and that's not very good. Right? And so one of the ways that you do to fix that is you establish a pattern that people can understand either consciously or subconsciously. In this game, it's that, you know, things are about time and here's how long the worlds are and there's a dinosaur at the end and all of that, right?
Right. 12 puzzle pieces, put them together, et cetera, et cetera.
And that gives you, I mean, I don't know what the right language is, but there's some kind of value to that. There's an amount of good gameness that you get out of that approach.
It's like a predictability of some aspect of the game.
Yes.
That helps hold it together, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, but it's deeper and subtler than that.
Okay.
Right? There are many aspects to it. Right?
Okay.
All sorts of things, like the feeling that the player is in good hands with the designer comes from this, for example.
Right.
Their ability to solve puzzles comes from them understanding what the hell is expected from them. And, and all sorts of things like that.
Yes.
So this is where value comes from. And you could be more good or less good about establishing those patterns and sticking to them, right, consistently. If you don't establish the patterns solidly enough, even if you as a designer think that they're there, the players won't realize that they're there and they won't work as well as you would think. Now, suppose you do a good job establishing those patterns and following those patterns. Then what? Is there more value to get after that? And I think the answer is yes.
Okay.
Because once you've established a pattern, there is now surprise in breaking the pattern.
Okay.
And breaking the pattern is not coherent if you have not established the pattern, because it just seems like randomness.
Okay.
But once the pattern is there, if you break it, then it's an extra moment that the player gets to have on top of what they have already had. A different example of a pattern break that's a lot more subtle in this game is, well, the epilogue that you get to at the end, right? Even the final level before the epilogue is pretty different from what else happens in the game.
Right.
That acts as a break and also just like a dramatic, it makes it feel like a heightened moment that it's so different from the rest of the game.
Yes.
But then in the epilogue, I straight up break rules that were constant through the rest of the game. For example, like obstacles look a certain way. They have high frequency details and are well defined and all that. And then in the epilogue, you can just like walk behind stuff.
Okay.
All of a sudden, right?
Okay.
And I don't know that that's something that players will consciously get, but it's different from what's happening, right?
Okay.
There is stuff to play in the epilogue involving the story, right? And game mechanical items, which heretofore have never been in the same place at the same time, right? So that's like a pattern disruption or a convolution of what had been established already. The thing that you do for those or what you get for interacting with them is a different class of thing, right? And again, I don't want to go too much into it, but it's different. So I'm breaking the pattern established by the game up to that point, but I'm not in danger of disrupting the game because this is a tiny part at the end, right?
Where does this idea come from? Because, yes, like if you go listen to that lecture that you gave, it's very clear that you think that, for example, some of the stuff you do in Braid has these sequence breaks, some of the things you do in The Witness have these sequence break ideas. And you talk about, if on a winter's night, a traveler potentially having these sequence breaks. Like, you're not sure, but you're like, your interpretation of the book is like, if you look at it this way, there's these possible things where it's like, oh, he sets up something that happens recurringly, and then all of a sudden in one chapter it doesn't happen, intentional, unintentional, like what am I reading into, what's going on, and it creates this like interest there. And what I was wondering is that something you're realizing after the fact, or did you realize that in the books at the time and you carried that forward and that's where it comes from in Braid, or is it something totally else? Like, how does this idea arise? Because it's not something that is often talked about elsewhere.
I don't think I ever got it from anyone else. I don't know if anyone else in the games industry has said this kind of thing.
Okay.
But my perception of it is that this is just an idea that I developed on my own. Okay. Now, is it influenced by stuff like Calvino and all this stuff? I mean, probably. Like, at the very least, this idea of this abstract multidimensional pattern that we're putting together is certainly influenced by those books because they do that all over the place.
Yeah.
And you could say that that's what I try to do when I do an end game or something like that, right? An end game is probably a special case of a pattern break that a lot more people are familiar with, right?
This is probably bigger and more important pattern break in a way.
Yes, but I like to play around with it all over the place. Another way to think about it that you'll understand, because we've talked about this before.
Okay.
Just in terms of like economics and capitalism, right?
Okay.
There's just this phenomenon, right? Where, like, let's say you start a company and you're famous for making high quality things or whatever, right? You establish this pattern that people associate you with high quality things. And the thing that inevitably happens is somebody comes along and says, we've stored up a great deal of potential energy that we are not exploiting because we're spending all this money on quality, right? If we stop spending money on quality, it'll take people a while to figure it out. And in that time, we'll make a bunch of money. And then eventually we'll have depleted our brand value and we'll crater, right?
Okay.
But that like happens with literally everything, intentional or not.
Okay.
That's the pattern.
Okay.
There's establishing this pattern of being something valuable that people want. And then now that there's a bunch of potential energy in there, converting that potential energy to kinetic energy, right?
Okay.
So this is like that. And in fact, it is a little bit similar in that even once you've established a pattern, if you break it a whole bunch after that, you obliterate it.
Right. So in the same way you said, if you completely trash the brand value, then
yes.
But in this case, you're not trying to trash any value. You're trying to make it be good.
Yes, I'm adding to it. Yeah. But I'm just trying to tell you, like that idea that I have about this thing that happens with brands, I don't know where I picked that up. And I mean, it's obviously something that's true, but like I think about it in this way of like storing potential energy. Like you're building a strong structure that can then withstand you poking some holes in it.
So if I then create yet another analogy for this tortured set of analogies we're using. So in some sense, what I hear you saying now is it's almost like building up, it's the ski jumper. If I build up enough speed, I can go off this jump and do a cool trick. I can't keep doing that because I will just crater into the ground. But if I set myself up properly, I can sort of have enough, like, it's almost like design momentum. I can have enough design momentum to carry me through a wilder space that I would not have been able to sustain continuously. But because I'm only going to do it for this trick, and I've done a good job setting myself up, I can accomplish this thing that's more than what I could have done if that had to be the whole game or something. You have a pattern momentum that allows you to do something you couldn't otherwise have done on its own.
I mean, I think that analogy makes more sense with regard to Braid and whatever. If you imagine that, like, the ski jump was 95% of it was the downhill part.
Yeah.
And everybody paid attention to the downhill part as being, and you did stuff on it.
Slalom, it's slalom or whatever, for some reason, yeah.
And then you do the jump.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But in reality, like, the jump is kind of the point. Right?
Yeah,
and
that's
that
true.
makes it a little
makes
different.
It a worse
I mean,
analogy.
I could imagine a game like that, but I haven't done that game.
Right.
You know? Yeah. The idea was that the rewind was a surprise, right?
Right.
And so before World 2, there was actually World 1.
Yes, there was.
And World 1 was, you play this platformer and it's got the monsters and stuff on it, and there's no rewind.
Right.
And so that you can do even less with that, right?
Right.
But it's a little bit like, well, jump on the guys' heads and practice jumping over pits and stuff. And the thing is, because in the rules of the world, there are death conditions. There just were.
Yeah.
And in that one, you would respawn at the beginning.
Right.
And then later, in World 2, you would get the ability to rewind, right? And that seemed good to me, except I already kind of knew, you know, like when a movie comes out where, like, the reason you're supposed to watch it is because, like, I don't know, 2012 or some ridiculous movie like that, where like, oh, it's because the world's getting destroyed in this movie.
Right.
You can't have that be like a surprise that you devote sufficient dramatic time to in the movie, because everybody knows this thing.
Okay,
and
so you figured when this game came out, people would talk about it or see trailers, and it's like they would already know that there's rewind, so it's just kind of...
It seemed like a
lame duck thing.
That was one of the elements I was thinking about, but there were some other ones, like, well, respawning with infinite lives is almost a superpower of its own. That's not as good as rewind, but, like, it's diminishing rewind to have, like, oh, you just respawn at the start of the level or whatever.
Okay.
And I could put lives in and whatever, and then have it be, hey, isn't it cool that the lives don't matter anymore? But that seemed like a big conceit.
Yeah.
And also, it just seemed like the gameplay before rewind just wasn't going to be that good. And so I had this worry. So again, I have no reason to believe anyone's going to play this game, right?
Right.
Like, Sean had released Chromatron and like 100 people played it or something.
Right.
So I was like, it's bad to have people play through a whole world that's maybe even a little bit hard or something.
Right.
And not even know why the game's supposed to be good.
Right.
So, like, why not let them know right away? And again, I mean, this goes to the Psalm 46 speech again, like, let them know right away why the game's good.
Yeah.
You know, why do this thing? And so the idea of rewind being a surprise was a little bit fun, but I was like, in reality, it's probably not going to work. And so I'm not going to worry about it. But for quite a while, the game had a World 1 where you just don't die. And you've just got to get to the end of it.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the other thing. Like, it was sort of inherently hard because there's nothing else. There's no other challenge, maybe apart from getting to the end of the world. I mean, maybe you could have had the puzzle pieces all off to the side. I don't know. It just seems like a nothing burger, right?
Yeah,
to be able to walk through that world and, like, there's nothing going on.
Right.
There are exceptions. This is not a game of ironclad consistency everywhere. And I think that's just part of what makes it interesting. You know, like you can imagine generating a simple algorithmic pattern like a square wave or something, and you can convince people that it's very advanced and refined because it's so repeatable and so perfect. But at the same time, it's like, well, it's kind of boring to look at and kind of boring to listen to. And if you were to add some more things to that shape in occasional places, then you get both. You get the square wave part. People recognize the shape, but then they also can notice the deviations from the shape. And that's actually similar to what we were saying in the interview about breaking patterns, right? Establishing patterns and then getting a little bit more juice out of breaking the pattern. It's a little bit different.
It's very musical as well, in some sense. I mean, everyone kind of intuitively knows
that their favorite song has a lot of repetition in it, but it is not just one measure repeated the entire time. What oftentimes makes a song interesting is one part where we change from one thing to another, or where we put in a particular flourish that isn't in the rest of the repetitious part of the song, right? So, like, I would think that people kind of intuitively, at some sense, know that an exact algorithm repeated over and over again is not what feels the best to experience.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, another way to explain this, too, for computer people is the information theory angle, right? Mm-hmm. Which is that, you know, if you take some model as like surprise is enjoyable or new information is enjoyable, right? What is new information? It's a deviation from what you can predict, right? Now, in order to predict things, you need to have a thesis about what the next thing is going to be, which means you need to observe and detect a pattern that you know how to continue in your mind, and then surprise can happen, right? If you don't put the surprise in, if you just do the pattern, that's better than randomness probably, but it becomes boring because there's no new information, right?
And at the same time, you have to have the ability to have that consistency, because otherwise it's also not surprising, because in a thing of randomness, nothing is a surprise. Anything goes. And so it's not really all that surprising to you because there was no pattern to break. So it's almost like you need both. You have to have a balance between both. You can't just do one or the other.
I wanted it to be an art game, but unapologetically an art game, right? Because I'd been thinking about art games and experimental games and all this stuff, and I was seeing that certain classes of things were not being made, right? Like,
but what does that mean? What does art game mean? Because it's one thing, you know, kind of, if I could bring it back to the Game Rants mailing list,
yeah,
where the aforementioned rewind mail came from. Another post that I made on that mailing list, I remember very clearly, was somehow in some discussion or something, someone may have used the word pretentious to describe something. And I literally wrote an email saying, I would love it if we were already at the point where I ever played anything that I would describe as pretentious. Because at that time, there was nothing that was even trying and failing to be an art game, let alone being an art game.
Yes.
And so I feel like that you using that terminology is a little confusing for me, knowing what it was like at that time, because what did that even mean? Right?
Yes, I can definitely get more specific about it, right?
Yeah.
So I felt like if you look at another genre, like film or novels or whatever, the best art had a few. Obviously, everything varies by genre, right? Every genre is a different thing, but there's some commonalities that I could observe. Like, the best art was not designed by a committee primarily for making money,
right?
Which is what the majority of the games industry was even at that time, and what it was clearly heading toward, right? It had some stamp of the individual on it. Here is something that somebody cares about, and maybe wishes to communicate or express. And even the word communicate is like kind of a red flag, because it's very easy for people to misinterpret that, right? Back in grade school, in English class, you get taught this very formulaic thing about how stories are, right? You read the story, and there's basically a secret message in the story that it's your job to understand and then write the 5-paragraph essay about like what that is.
Right? Yes.
That always felt too trivial to me. And as I had graduated to like college and beyond and found what do I really enjoy reading, right? It's just never that simple. Like, there's stuff that people care about, but it's bigger than like hiding the marble in the oatmeal, right?
Right.
It's like,
what is the green light at the end of the dock is not the whole point of the thing,
no,
right? Or whatever,
No. And then, in fact, all these things are complex and multidimensional. And I also saw that people were not really trying to even do that in games. Like, where is the complex, multidimensional meaning in games?
Right.
And even for people who were making independent games, there was this struggle to be polished, right?
Right.
Like you're in indie, you're doing some stuff, it looks crappy.
Right.
You want people to play it and not think it sucks. So you're spending all this time trying to make the bitmaps look nice, like Nintendo makes them or whatever.
Right, yeah.
And if you were that, imagine you're that as a person.
Okay.
And you go to like dinner parties or something. And you're always like, I am exerting effort in everything I say and every move I make at this dinner party to present the most refined picture of myself so that I look as good as possible and so that everybody likes me as much as possible.
Okay.
I mean, on the one hand, everybody does a little of that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, that's kind of a psychopath or somebody who's never, that person is never going to become really good friends with anyone at the dinner party and like establish valuable relationships because they're not letting you see them.
Okay.
Right. And so there was some idea that all of this polish. So first of all, you're never going to compete with the AAA budgets. Even back then, the budgets were merely $20 or $30 million or whatever.
Yes, right. Yeah.
So you're not going to compete with that on polish. So what are you doing? And why, as an indie, you should be trying to A, realize what you can't really do. So don't try and do that. But B, again, like with the EGW manifesto, realize what you are in a tactical position to do that the greater amount of money prevents those players from doing, right?
I see.
And that involves having a personal viewpoint.
I see.
It involves having things be imperfect. It involves like, this looks a little sloppy, but it's expressive in a way that you won't see out of things that are polished all the heck, right?
That's very interesting. So in some sense, you are saying two things that are, it's the same conclusion, but from two totally different perspectives. One is that you would like there to be this kind of game because there is this kind of thing in other medium and there should be in this one.
Yes.
And the other is that actually this makes business sense. Like if you think of yourself as you're going to survive as an indie and make a bunch of games, if your whole thing is just like try to be as close to AAA as possible, you're kind of always probably going to fail to a certain extent because it's just going to keep getting worse for you. So why not stake out a place they can't go?
Well, it definitely makes business sense, and I would tell that to people all the time. But it also just makes creative sense. Like if you want to contribute to the form, you can't do it by competing with AAA. Like that doesn't make sense, right? But you can do it by going in a different direction that you are set up to succeed in. And so that's a case where creative incentives and financial incentives overlap. Which is actually a very valuable territory because that's the space in which artists can survive while having integrity. Which is something that our culture doesn't understand to this day. Like you'll see all these people who say they're artists, but then they compromise what they're doing to make money, like constantly.
Yes.
And the idea here was like, I think I see a space where I can do something that some people will want to buy and play. If they don't, great. I still made something cool. But that I don't have to be compromising to try and do that. The whole time since I got into the game industry, there was this ongoing discussion in the background, like, are games an art form?
Yes.
And there are lots of people who would say, oh, they totally are because X, Y, and Z. But I would look at it and be like, you're telling me because of story or whatever, but the stories suck compared to movies and books, at least the ones that I know. So like, really? And so there's this question for me is like, how are games a good art form? What can you do in them that is special to games, right? You look at films have cinematography. You don't have that in a stage play, right? Which is how film started, is just setting up a camera and filming a stage play, right? You don't really have cinematography in a book, although you maybe have something a little bit analogous to it, but it works and feels very differently, right? And so, well, what about games? And people had their pat answer even back then. It's like, oh, it's the interactivity. Okay, but what about it, right? Like if you start talking about cinematography, you can break that down into a ton of different techniques, right? Some of which are so basic, they go in the script, right? Establishing shot is in the script. What's the establishing shot of interactivity, right? What's the, list out the 37 different things and tell me what they are. And nobody really had an answer for that. And so I was interested, like, what is that? Can I make a contribution to that? Can I figure out what some of these things are? And I'm not sure to what degree Braid specifically did that. It probably did a little bit, but it's also like that's the territory I was trying to mine for EGW and all this stuff. I was very deliberate, though, about this is an art game. That means it's expressive. That means the art style, whatever it is in the end, is not going to be very cookie cutter. It's not going to be a bunch of tiles that look the same. It's going to be like analog. It's going to be brush strokes from a paintbrush or something, because that in the medium of painting, what makes a painting, it's not just that like paint came out of a brush, right? It's that was used in ways that took a good deal of skill and refinement to figure out, here are the things we can do with a paint coming out of a brush. And you can look at that example created by painters and see what they did. And there's a challenge again in games. Maybe we want to start using that. We're at a time when graphics are better. We can afford to do this. It doesn't have to be a bunch of little tiles, yet you see people maybe still doing a bunch of tiles. Okay, let's get some more expressivity in there. I don't want to copy painting, but I want to try and use that channel better. With audio, platformers typically had 1 minute, 2 minute long little repeating themes because that's what would fit in memory on a Nintendo. And then people just copied that. And like, why don't I have a song that's more analog? It's just like it's sampled. I like cellos. Let's put some cellos in this game, right? Let's have them be longer and more complex because we can, and because that's helps me build a feeling that is not the generic mascot platformer feeling, right? That's a thing that everybody was familiar with at the time. Oh, this is Ratchet over here. And then this game, what's the Insomniac? Or that is
Crash
Ratchet
Bandicoot?
Crash Bandicoot, whatever. Blinks the Time Sweeper is a mascot platformer with rewind that I think came out after I had started Braid, or maybe slightly before.
I think it may have came out during Braid production,
Certainly well before Braid was done. And all of these games are kind of trying to do the same thing. They're polished. They're designed by committee to make money by living in this aesthetic zone of the mascot platformer that is well understood, appeals to kids. Adults can still play it. You can sell toys based on the mascot, and you can make a franchise out of it. So walk away from all of those bullet points, and where do you end up, right? You can actually use those as points in space, and instead of an attractor field, put a repeller field on it, right?
Just don't go anywhere near where that would be.
Now, the problem is, without an attractor point somewhere, what that ends up being is repelling you arbitrarily out into space in all directions. So you have to have attractor points. But if those are my repeller points and I have other attractor points, personal, uses this idea of weird physics as an analog to human scale paradoxes of existence, based around the mechanic, has this inverse illustrated storybook. Like, all these ideas were things that I wanted to do. And so I had the things I wanted to do and the things I didn't want to do. And that together was enough. That still isn't a concrete game idea, but it was enough to create some field that I could navigate very easily.
Is Trinity at all a touch point here? Because when I said I wouldn't even know what art game was, and I said I wrote that Game Rants thing, I had never played Trinity. And I'm pretty sure that if I thought pretty hard about it, I really wouldn't find anything else. But that game does kind of stand out, and you have referenced it, so I'll quickly ask, is that at all in your mind on this one, or is that more a Witness thing later on? Like are you thinking of like, oh wait, no, I do know there was an art game once a long time ago or something, or did you kind of have forgotten about it at this point and it comes back up later?
Well, no, I feel like there were several art games in the 80s.
Oh, really?
Well, Trinity was the one that meant the most to me. Like, it was my exemplar of an art game.
Okay.
Like, it can use fiction as a model for how to do this thing that you're talking about, of having realizations take place in your mind and not on the screen, right? So there are very well chosen things in that game, just these elements around the game, like what's in the world and what do you deal with and under what circumstances, right? And that's along the lines, like some of the meaning that is evident there is along the lines of the kind of thing that you would learn badly in English class or whatever, but it's like the better version of it, right? And the game never says, hey, did you get it?
Right.
By the way, this thing means that.
Yes.
Firstly,
yes.
I mean, I don't want to speak for him, but at least for two reasons, right? One reason is because that removes agency from you, and it removes, even if you don't get it the first time, part of replayability is that you can go back to something and get something new out of it. And if I just like told you the thing, firstly, it prevents you from having that experience of getting the new thing. But secondly, you get an inferior realization of it. Because these things are complex and subtle and multidimensional, and when there are just elements and it's your job to build the connective tissue between them in your mind, that connective tissue can be quite delicate. And you may not even know how to put it into words. And in fact, the author may not know how to put it into words without messing it up or making it more coarse or destroying it. And that is really, there's this idea of fine art, right? And I feel like that's part of fine art is it's not just skill, but there's something there that you can say that it's not just that you're choosing to say it in this medium, it's that you couldn't say it not in the medium.
Yes.
And Trinity has that, and very few games have that.
Yes.
Yeah, and maybe all that's left to say about that is that I've had some picture the whole time, and I don't know if I realized this was directly from Trinity. I think I just knew that Trinity was this really good art game that I enjoyed. But for way longer than I've been in games, like back when I wrote fiction and stuff, I definitely had this aesthetic of there are things I'm trying to get at. They're hard to express.
Yes.
And so you maybe express them by demarcating the space around them to sort of make the negative space image or the silhouette of them or something. And then people can pattern match on that and get something out of it that they wouldn't be able to get if you just clumsily scribbled it in crayon.
Right.
I am not a practitioner of Zen, but there's a Zen parable. It's like someone's going to the master and asking for enlightenment, and he keeps pointing at the moon.
Okay.
Right. And the guy's like, so what? What's so special about your finger? Right. Because he keeps looking at the finger. Right.
I see.
Where the job of the finger is to indicate something far away.
I see.
Right. And the less of a finger you put, the less likely somebody is going to like fixate on that.
On the finger. Okay.
Now, that said, the atomic bomb stuff in Braid is a very strong signal that many people fixate on. And had I realized how strong that fixation would be, I might have tuned it differently. Yeah. But nevertheless, for my first big, like, trying to be an art game, right? All these previous projects we talked about were not trying to be this kind of art.
Right.
And it's interesting that it took me a while to get there, but when I get there, I already knew what I was doing. So obviously this had been percolating for a long time, but like Wolfram was not an art game in this way. It was just like, I'm going to try and have smart game design.
Right.
And do a challenging technical thing. But that example of Trinity rode with me the whole time and came out later, 20 years later or whatever.